Welcome, dear soul, to this sacred journey through the night. As you settle into comfort, allow your breathing to slow and deepen. Tonight, we travel together through ancient wisdom that has guided seekers for over 2,500 years. In the mountains of Tibet, where prayer flags flutter in the eternal wind, monks have discovered secrets that make the human spirit unbreakable. Not through hardness, but through flexibility. Not through fighting, but through flowing. Tonight, these timeless teachings will wash over you like a gentle stream, seeping into your consciousness as you rest. Let your eyes close softly. Feel your body sinking into complete relaxation. Your only task is to listen, to breathe, and to allow these ancient seeds of wisdom to plant themselves in the fertile soil of your peaceful mind. Principle 1. Words can never really hurt you. Our first journey begins in the misty mountains of ancient Tibet, where monasteries clung to cliffsides like jewels scattered across stone. In one such monastery lived a young monk named Tenzin, whose story would teach us the first principle of becoming truly unshakable. This isn't just a story from long ago. It's a mirror that will show you something profound about your own inner strength. Something you've always possessed, but perhaps never recognized. Every morning, as the first golden rays of sunlight pierced through the mountain mist, Tenzin would wrap his saffron robes around himself and begin the winding descent to the village below. His wooden alms bowl, smooth from countless hands, would rest gently in his palms as he walked the ancient stone path that generations of monks had worn smooth with their footsteps. The mountain air was thin and pure, carrying the scent of pine and the distant sound of prayer flags fluttering in the eternal wind. The village nestled in the valley was home to simple people, farmers who worked the terraced fields, herders who guided their yaks across high meadows, and shopkeepers who sold the necessities of mountain life. Most of these villagers held deep respect for the monks, understanding that these men had dedicated their lives to something beyond the ordinary concerns of daily existence. They would bow their heads slightly when Tenzin passed, offering rice, vegetables, or tea with genuine warmth. But there was one man in this village whose heart had grown hard with disappointment. Norbu was a merchant who had once traveled far and wide, bringing goods from distant lands to sell in mountain villages. His shop had been filled with colorful fabrics, exotic spices, and treasures from places most villagers had only heard about in stories. But a series of failed ventures, dishonest partners, and simple bad luck had slowly drained away his wealth and, more tragically, his faith in the goodness of the world. Now Norbu's shop stood nearly empty, its shelves holding only dust and bitter memories. His family had moved to the larger city below, unable to bear the shame of their reduced circumstances. He remained alone, his heart poisoned by resentment that had fermented like wine left too long in a broken barrel. And every morning, when young Tenzin passed by with his peaceful demeanor and gentle smile, something inside Norbu would twist with rage. "Lazy monk," Norbu would shout, his voice echoing off the stone walls of the narrow street. "Worthless beggar, why don't you work like the rest of us, instead of living off others' kindness?" His words were sharp as mountain ice, designed to cut and wound. The other villagers would wince and look away, embarrassed by the daily spectacle but unsure how to intervene. But here's what made Tenzin remarkable, what made his response so powerful that it would eventually transform not just his own life, but the life of his tormentor and everyone who witnessed this daily drama. Tenzin never argued back. He never defended himself or explained why Nobu was wrong. He never hurried past or took a different route to avoid the confrontation. Instead, he would pause, place his palms together at his chest in a gesture of prayer, bow slightly toward the angry merchant, and continue on his way with the same serene expression he wore while meditating in the monastery's highest tower. The villagers couldn't understand it. How could someone absorb such poison day after day without it affecting them? How could harsh words that would have sent most people into rage or tears seem to simply pass through Tenzin like wind through an open window? They began to gather at a respectful distance each morning, not out of cruel curiosity, but out of genuine wonder at witnessing something they instinctively recognized as profound. This continued for months, through the brief mountain summer when wildflowers painted the hillsides in impossible colors, through the golden autumn when prayer flags snapped more fiercely in the cold wind, and into the harsh winter when snow made the path treacherous and the air so thin that each breath was visible as a small cloud. Still, every morning brought the same ritual, angry words hurled like stones, and peaceful acceptance that seemed to swallow those words without a trace. Then came the morning that would change everything. A small girl named Pema, no more than 7 years old, had been watching this daily exchange from behind her grandmother's vegetable stall. Children, with their natural wisdom and unfiltered curiosity, often see truths that adults miss. This particular morning, as Tenzin made his way back up the mountain path, little Pema broke away from her grandmother and ran after him, her small legs working hard to keep up with his steady pace. "Master Tenzin," she called, her breath coming in small puffs in the cold air. "Please wait." The monk turned, his face lighting up with the gentle smile he reserved for children, a smile that seemed to contain all the warmth of summer sunshine. "What is it, little flower?" he asked, using the pet name that made Pema giggle. "I have a question that keeps me awake at night," she said with the seriousness that only children can bring to truly important matters. "When the angry man says those mean things to you every morning, why don't they hurt you? When other children say mean things to me, my chest feels tight and my eyes want to cry. But you always look so peaceful, like you're listening to beautiful music instead of ugly words." Tenzin's eyes crinkled with understanding. Here was a question that deserved more than words. It deserved a demonstration that would plant a seed of wisdom in this young heart. He looked around and spotted a smooth, flat stone on the path, worn round by countless seasons of rain and wind. "Come with me, Pema," he said, taking her small hand in his. "I want to show you something." He led her to the monastery's meditation pond, a perfect circle of water that reflected the sky so clearly it seemed like a window into heaven itself. The water was so still that every cloud, every bird that passed overhead, every branch that swayed in the breeze was captured in perfect detail on its surface. It was a mirror of such clarity that visitors would often stand in silent amazement, feeling as if they were looking down into another world. "Watch very carefully, little one," Tenzin said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. He held up the stone so Pema could see it clearly, smooth and grey, about the size of a child's fist. Then, with a gentle underhand motion, he threw it into the center of the pond. The stone hit the water with a splash that seemed to shatter the perfect reflection into 1,000 dancing pieces. Ripples spread outward in perfect concentric circles, each one growing larger and fainter as it traveled toward the pond's edges. The beautiful reflection of clouds and sky was completely gone, replaced by a constantly shifting pattern of light and shadow. For a moment, the peaceful mirror had become a chaos of movement. Pema watched with wide eyes as the ripples continued their journey across the water's surface. But then something magical began to happen. Gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, the ripples began to grow smaller. The wild motion began to settle. The water started to remember its true nature. And then, as if by miracle, the pond returned to perfect stillness. The sky reappeared in its depths, clear and undisturbed. A single white cloud drifted across the reflected heavens, and a bird's shadow passed over the water like a blessing. It was as if the stone had never been thrown at all. "Do you see?" Tenzin asked, his voice warm with the joy of a teacher who knows his student is about to understand something beautiful. The angry merchant's words are like that stone. They hit the pond of my mind and create ripples. I'm human after all, and harsh words do create an initial disturbance. But here's what I've learned through many years of practice and many more years of mistakes. He paused, allowing the child to lean closer, her face bright with curiosity. The ripples are not the pond. The disturbance is not who I am. Just as this water returns to stillness because that is its deepest nature, my mind returns to peace because that is its deepest nature. The merchant's anger lives in his heart, not mine. His words can create temporary ripples, but they cannot change what I truly am. Little Pema's eyes widened as the understanding began to dawn. So the mean words can't really hurt you because you know they're just ripples. Her voice held that tone of wonder that comes when a profound truth clicks into place. Exactly, dear child. And here's the most beautiful part of all. When we don't hold on to the ripples, when we let them naturally fade away just as this pond did, our hearts remain open. We can even feel compassion for the person throwing stones, because we understand that their anger comes from their own pain, their own suffering. Tenzin knelt down so he was at Pema's eye level, his hands resting gently on her shoulders. Think about Norbu, the merchant who shouts at me each morning. Do you think he was always angry? Do you think he came into this world with hatred in his heart? Pema shook her head, her intuition telling her that no one is born with such bitterness. I remember when he first came to our village, Tenzin continued. He was younger then, full of dreams and energy. His shop was bright with colors and alive with the stories of his travels. He would speak of distant lands with such joy that children would gather just to listen. But disappointment after disappointment wore away at his hope, like wind and rain wearing down a mountain. Now his pain is so great that it spills out onto anyone who reminds him of what he's lost. But why do you remind him of what he's lost? Pema asked, her young mind working to understand the complexities of human nature. Because when he sees me walking peacefully, content with simple robes and a wooden bowl, It reminds him of a time when he thought happiness came from having many possessions. My contentment reflects his discontent, just as this still pond reflects the sky. He's not really angry at me. He's angry at his own pain, his own lost dreams. Understanding this helps me respond with compassion instead of defensiveness. Buddha taught us that peace comes from within. Do not seek it without. This ancient wisdom was living proof before young Pema's eyes. Tenzin had found a peace so deep that nothing external could disturb it for long. Not harsh words, not unfair treatment, not even daily doses of someone else's poison. But how do you make the ripples go away? Pema asked, her question cutting straight to the heart of practical wisdom. When someone says mean things to me, the hurt feeling stays for a long time. Tenzin smiled, recognizing in this child's question the same struggle that every human faces. The secret is not to fight the ripples or pretend they're not there. When harsh words hit your mind, you might feel hurt, anger, or sadness, and that's perfectly natural. The mistake is thinking that these feelings define you or that you must hold on to them. He picked up another small stone and held it in his palm. "Watch again," he said, and gently tossed it into the pond. Again the ripples spread. Again the perfect reflection was disturbed. Now, what would happen if I jumped into the pond and tried to smooth out the ripples with my hands? Pema giggled at the image. "You'd just make more ripples." Exactly. Fighting the ripples creates more disturbance. But if I simply wait and trust in the water's nature. They watched together as the pond once again returned to perfect stillness. "This is what meditation teaches us," Tenzin explained. "We learn to observe our thoughts and feelings without being swept away by them. We learn to trust that our deepest nature, like this pond, is peace. When someone throws stones, harsh words, unfair treatment, criticism, we feel the initial splash, but we don't jump in and thrash around trying to fix it. We simply wait for our natural peace to return." As they sat by the pond, the morning sun climbed higher, warming their faces and sparkling on the water's surface. Other monks had begun their daily activities, some tending the gardens, others copying sacred texts, still others preparing for the day's teachings. The monastery hummed with quiet purpose, each person contributing to the whole while maintaining their individual practice. "Master Tenzin," Pema said quietly, "will you teach me how to be like the pond?" Her request was so sincere, so filled with genuine desire to learn, that it touched something deep in the monk's heart. Here was proof that wisdom could be passed from one generation to the next, that the teachings could take root in fresh soil. "The teaching has already begun," he replied. "Every time you remember this pond when someone speaks harshly to you, you're practicing. Every time you choose to let hurt feelings fade away naturally, instead of holding on to them, you're growing stronger. Every time you look at an angry person and wonder what pain might be driving their behavior, you're developing compassion." He stood and brushed the dust from his robes. "But there's something else I want you to understand, little flower. This doesn't mean we become stones, feeling nothing. It doesn't mean we don't care when others are hurt, or that we accept cruelty without response. The pond feels the stone's impact. It simply doesn't let that impact define its nature. "What do you mean?" Pema asked, walking beside him as they headed back toward the village. "Sometimes, when someone is drowning in their own anger and pain, the kindest thing we can do is remain calm and peaceful. Our stillness becomes a reminder that peace is possible. Other times, compassion might require us to speak up, to set boundaries, or to take action to protect ourselves or others. The key is responding from a place of wisdom rather than reacting from a place of hurt." As they approached the village, Pema suddenly stopped walking. "Master Tenzin, I want to try something. Tomorrow morning, when you pass by Norbu's shop and he says mean things, I'm going to imagine him as someone who's hurting inside. I'm going to try to feel sorry for his pain instead of angry at his words." Tenzin's eyes sparkled with delight. "Now you're thinking like a true Buddhist, little one. But remember, if you find it difficult at first, that's perfectly normal. Even experienced monks sometimes struggle with harsh treatment. The practice is not about being perfect. It's about returning to peace more quickly each time." The next morning brought a surprise that no one in the village expected. As Tenzin made his usual journey down the mountain path, and as Pema positioned herself behind her grandmother's stall to watch the daily confrontation, something different happened. Norbu emerged from his shop as always, his face dark with its customary anger. But when he opened his mouth to hurl his usual insults, he found himself looking into the eyes of a small girl who was watching him with an expression he had never seen before. Not fear, not judgment, but something that looked almost like understanding. The words died in his throat. For just a moment, the hardened merchant felt something crack in the armor of his bitterness. A 7-year-old child was looking at him with more compassion than he had shown himself in years. Tenzin, noticing the shift, bowed slightly deeper than usual and continued on his way. But something had changed in the spiritual atmosphere of that small village street. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountain peaks and painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Pema ran to the monastery to find Tenzin. She was breathless with excitement. Master, something wonderful happened. When I looked at Norbu this morning and tried to see his pain instead of his anger, I felt something change inside me. I wasn't scared of him anymore, and I think he felt it too." Tenzin nodded knowingly. "This is the power of the unshakable mind, Pema. When we truly understand that others' harsh words come from their own suffering, we stop taking those words personally. When we stop taking them personally, we stop reacting with hurt or anger. And when we stop reacting, we create space for something new to happen: understanding, compassion, even healing." Buddha's words echoed across the centuries. Holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. Young Pema had discovered this truth not through scholarly study, but through the direct experience of letting go. She had learned that the person who benefits most from forgiveness is not the one being forgiven, but the one doing the forgiving. In the days that followed, the daily confrontation between Norbu and Tenzin began to transform. The merchant's words became less sharp, his voice less certain. Sometimes he would emerge from his shop, but remain silent, simply watching as the peaceful monk passed by. Other villagers began to notice the change, and whispers of hope began to replace whispers of embarrassment. One morning, nearly a year after Pema had first asked her question by the pond, Norbu did something that shocked everyone who witnessed it. As Tenzin approached his shop, the merchant stepped forward, not with anger, but with uncertainty. "Monk," he said, his voice rough from disuse of kind words, I have been unkind to you. Every day for months, and you have never responded with anger. Why?" Tenzin stopped and looked at Norbu with the same peaceful expression he had worn through all those months of insults. "Because your anger was never really about me," he said simply. "It was about your pain. And pain, when it's understood with compassion, eventually transforms into wisdom." Norbu's eyes filled with tears, the first tears he had allowed himself to shed since his world had fallen apart. "I've been so angry," he whispered. Angry at the world, angry at life, angry at anyone who seemed to have what I had lost. But mostly angry at myself for failing. "And now?" Tenzin asked gently. "Now I'm tired of being angry. Tired of carrying this poison inside me. Can you teach me what you know? Can you show me how to find peace the way you have?" This is the miracle that happens when we learn to be like the pond, unshakable in our deepest nature, able to return to peace, no matter what stones are thrown into our consciousness. We don't just protect ourselves from others' negativity, we create possibilities for transformation that wouldn't exist if we responded with anger to anger, hurt to hurt. The first principle of becoming unshakable is this: understand that harsh words and cruel treatment say more about the person giving them than about you. When someone tries to disturb your peace, they're usually broadcasting their own pain. You can choose to receive that broadcast and let it disturb your inner stillness, or you can let it pass through you like ripples on water, returning to your natural state of peace. As you drift towards sleep tonight, carry with you the image of that monastery pond. Remember that your deepest nature, like the water's deepest nature, is stillness and peace. Tomorrow, when someone speaks harshly or treats you unfairly, you'll have a choice. You can let their pain become your pain, or you can remain centered in your own peace, and perhaps, like Tenzin, create space for healing to occur. The ripples are not the pond. The disturbance is not who you are. Rest now in the knowledge that nothing, no harsh word, no unfair treatment, no one else's anger, can permanently disturb the peace that is your birthright. You are unshakable because your true nature is as constant as water's ability to return to stillness, as reliable as the sun's ability to rise each morning, as eternal as the love that moves through all things. Principle 2. Everyone is your teacher. As our second journey unfolds, we travel from the high monastery of Tibet to the bamboo forests of ancient China, where a different kind of wisdom awaited discovery. Here, in a time when scholars and poets walked dusty roads seeking enlightenment, lived a Zen master whose understanding of human nature would challenge everything we think we know about difficult people. His name was Master Lin, and the lesson he taught would transform not just his students, but anyone who truly grasps its profound simplicity. Picture, if you will, a monastery unlike the stone fortress we visited in Tibet. This one was built of warm wood and paper screens, nestled in a grove of towering bamboo that whispered ancient secrets whenever the wind stirred their emerald leaves. The sound was like nature's own meditation, a soft, constant rustling that seemed to wash away the noise of the busy world beyond. Students came here from across the vast expanse of China, some traveling for months along dangerous mountain passes and through bandit-infested valleys, all seeking something that couldn't be found in books or bought with gold. Master Lin was known throughout the land, not for his stern discipline or harsh teachings, but for something far more rare, his infinite patience and his ability to see potential where others saw only problems. His eyes held the depth of someone who had looked long into the nature of human suffering and found not despair, but profound compassion. Students would often say that a single conversation with Master Lin could illuminate truths they had been searching for their entire lives. Among the many seekers who found their way to his monastery was a young man named Jian, whose arrival would test every ounce of Master Lin's legendary patience. Jian was brilliant. There was no denying that. His mind was sharp as a freshly forged blade, capable of cutting through complex philosophical arguments with startling precision. But somewhere in his 23 years of life, that brilliance had curdled into arrogance, and his sharp mind had become a weapon he used to prove his superiority over everyone around him. The other students noticed Jian's disruptive presence from his very first day. During the pre-dawn meditation, when the monastery was supposed to be wrapped in profound silence, Jian would arrive exactly 7 minutes late, his wooden sandals clicking deliberately against the polished floor. He would settle onto his meditation cushion with an elaborate display of adjusting his robes, clearing his throat, and shifting his position, each movement designed to draw attention to his arrival. The ripple of irritation that spread through the meditation hall was almost tangible, yet Master Lin never once turned his head or acknowledged the disruption. During the daily teaching sessions, when Master Lin would share insights from the great Buddhist texts or speak about the nature of enlightenment, Jian would interrupt with questions that weren't really questions at all, but thinly veiled attempts to demonstrate his own knowledge. "Master," he would say, his voice carrying just enough respect to avoid outright rudeness, "surely you're aware that the scholar Wei dynasty interpreted that passage quite differently. Or, while that's an interesting perspective, don't you think it contradicts what the Buddha taught about attachment in the Lotus Sutra?" These weren't the sincere inquiries of a student seeking understanding. They were intellectual traps, designed to make Master Lin look foolish or unprepared. Yet the master would respond to each challenge with genuine thoughtfulness, often saying, "What an excellent point, Jian. Let's explore that together," before launching into explanations that were somehow even deeper and more nuanced than his original teaching. But it was Jian's behavior during work periods that truly tested the community's patience. Each student was assigned daily tasks: sweeping the meditation hall, tending the vegetable garden, preparing meals, copying sacred texts. These weren't just chores, they were considered essential parts of spiritual practice, opportunities to cultivate mindfulness and humility. Jian, however, seemed to view manual labor as beneath someone of his intellectual caliber. He would disappear during garden work, claiming he needed to contemplate a particularly challenging philosophical concept. When it was his turn to sweep, he would do such a hasty, careless job that others had to redo his work. During meal preparation, he would position himself as far as possible from the actual cooking, preferring to engage anyone who would listen in elaborate discussions about the spiritual significance of different foods. The result was that the burden of Jan's neglected duties fell on his fellow students, who were already working hard to maintain the monastery while pursuing their own spiritual development. They began to gather during their free time, their voices tight with frustration as they shared their grievances. "It's not fair," whispered Chen, an earnest young man who had given up a promising career as a government official to seek enlightenment. "We're all here to learn, but we end up doing his work on top of our own. How can we focus on our practice when we're constantly cleaning up after his irresponsibility?" And his constant showing off during teachings, added Wei, an older student who had spent 3 years saving money for the journey to the monastery. "He's not trying to learn, he's trying to prove he's smarter than Master Lin. It's disrespectful, and it disrupts everyone's concentration." The complaints grew louder and more frequent. Students who had come seeking peace found themselves consumed with resentment toward their disruptive classmate. The harmonious atmosphere that Master Lin had carefully cultivated over decades was beginning to crack under the strain of one person's selfish behavior. Finally, on an evening when the bamboo grove was particularly restless in the wind, as if nature itself was reflecting the inner turmoil of the community, Wei approached Master Lin. The master was sitting in his favorite spot, a small wooden platform overlooking the monastery's pond, where lotus flowers floated like prayers made visible. The setting sun painted everything in warm gold, but Wei's face was dark with frustration. "Master," Wei began, his usual calm demeanor cracking with suppressed emotion, "we need to talk about Jan. His behavior is destroying the peace of our community. He's disrespectful during meditation, disruptive during teachings, and lazy during work. The other students are talking about leaving if something doesn't change." Master Lin nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the lotus blossoms that swayed gently in the evening breeze. "Tell me, Wei," he said, his voice as calm as still water, "what has Jian taught you?" Wei blinked in confusion. I don't understand, Master. What could I possibly learn from someone who shows no respect for our practice?" Master Lin smiled, not the gentle, approving smile he usually wore, but something deeper, tinged with a knowledge that seemed to encompass all of human nature's complexity. "Come," he said, rising from his meditation cushion. "Let me show you something." He led Wei to the monastery's garden, where an ancient pine tree stood silhouetted against the darkening sky. This tree was famous throughout the region, not for its beauty, though it was indeed beautiful, but for its resilience. For over 200 years, it had endured mountain storms that had felled trees twice its size. Its trunk was gnarled and twisted, bent by decades of harsh winds, yet it had grown strong and magnificent, its branches reaching toward heaven with unshakable determination. "This tree," Master Lin said, running his weathered hand along the deeply grooved bark, "do you think it curses the storms that have shaped it? Does it resent the harsh winds that bent its trunk and stripped its needles? Does it wish it had lived in a greenhouse, protected from all difficulties? Wei stared at the ancient pine, beginning to sense that his teacher was leading him toward an understanding that would challenge everything he thought he knew about obstacles and difficulties. "No, Master," he said slowly. "The storms made it strong." "Exactly," Master Lin said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a teacher whose student was beginning to glimpse the truth. This tree didn't become magnificent despite the storms. It became magnificent because of them. Each harsh wind that bent its branches forced it to sink deeper roots. Each winter that stripped its needles taught it to conserve energy and grow stronger. Every challenge that could have destroyed it instead became part of what made it beautiful. Wei was beginning to understand, but the implications of Master Lin's teaching were so radical that his mind resisted them. "But Master," he protested, "surely you're not saying that Jian's disruptive behavior is good for us?" Master Lin's eyes twinkled with something that might have been amusement. "Tell me, Wei, before Jian arrived at our monastery, how patient were you? How deep was your compassion for difficult people? How strong was your commitment to your practice when it wasn't convenient or comfortable?" The questions hit Wei like physical blows. He had always considered himself a patient person, but he realized now that his patience had never been truly tested. Living in the monastery before Jian's arrival had been pleasant, peaceful, easy. Everyone was dedicated, respectful, kind. It was simple to be patient with people who never challenged your patience. "Jian," Master Lin continued, "is showing you exactly where your spiritual practice is still shallow. He's revealing the places where your peace depends on external conditions rather than inner strength. He's teaching you the difference between conditional kindness and unconditional compassion." Wei felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the tight knot of resentment he had carried for months. "You're saying that my anger toward Jian is really about my own spiritual limitations?" "I'm saying that Jian is holding up a mirror," Master Lin replied. "And what you see in that mirror, the impatience, the judgment, the desire to control how others behave, these are the things that are blocking your path to enlightenment. Without Jian, you might have spent years thinking you were more advanced than you actually are." Buddha taught that when watching after yourself, you watch after others. When watching after others, you watch after yourself. In this ancient wisdom lay the key to understanding why every person we encounter, especially the difficult ones, are our teachers in disguise. "But what about the practical problems?" Wei asked, his logical mind still struggling with this new perspective. "What about the disrupted meditations, the extra work, the disrespectful questions? How do we handle those things if we're supposed to see Jian as a teacher?" Master Lin nodded approvingly. "Now you're asking the right question. Seeing someone as a teacher doesn't mean becoming passive or accepting harmful behavior. It means responding to challenges with wisdom instead of reacting with emotion." He gestured toward the monastery, where warm light glowed from the windows and the sound of evening chanting drifted on the wind. When Jian disrupts meditation, instead of feeling angry, we can practice deeper concentration. When he asks challenging questions, instead of feeling defensive, I can explore my teachings more deeply. When he avoids work, instead of resenting him, We can practice generosity by picking up his tasks. But doesn't that just enable his bad behavior? Wei protested. Does the tree enable the storm by bending with the wind instead of breaking? Master Lin asked. Sometimes the most powerful response to destructive behavior is to remain centered and peaceful. Sometimes compassion requires setting boundaries. The key is acting from wisdom rather than reacting from emotion. As they walked back toward the monastery, Wei found himself seeing everything differently. The students he had viewed as victims of Jian's behavior now appeared to him as people being offered a profound opportunity for growth. The disruptions he had seen as obstacles to spiritual progress now looked like perfect training grounds for developing unshakable peace. Master, Wei said quietly, what about Jian himself? If we're all learning from him, what is he learning? Is he benefiting from his own behavior? Master Lin stopped walking and turned to face his student. Now you're beginning to see with true compassion. Jian is the most isolated person in our community. His arrogance is a wall he's built to protect a heart that's afraid of being found inadequate. His disruptions are desperate attempts to feel important, to matter. He's teaching you patience and compassion, yes, but what he's learning is much harder. What is he learning? He's learning that no amount of intellectual brilliance can substitute for genuine human connection. He's learning that trying to prove your worth through superiority only leads to loneliness. Most importantly, he's learning, though he doesn't recognize it yet, what it feels like to be met with patience and kindness, even when you don't deserve it. Wei felt tears gathering in his eyes as he understood the full scope of what Master Lin was revealing. You've been teaching him too, haven't you? All those times when you responded to his disrespect with patience, when you answered his trap questions with genuine wisdom, you were showing him what unconditional compassion looks like. Every interaction is a teaching, Master Lin said, simply. When we respond to difficulty with wisdom instead of reactivity, we plant seeds. We may never see those seeds sprout, but that doesn't make the planting less important. In the days that followed Wei's conversation with Master Lin, something remarkable began to happen in the monastery. As Wei shared the Master's teaching with the other students, their entire relationship with Jian began to transform. Instead of seeing him as an obstacle to their spiritual progress, they began to see him as an essential part of it. When Jian arrived late to meditation, instead of feeling irritated, the students used his disruption as a reminder to sink deeper into their own concentration. When he asked his challenging questions during teachings, instead of viewing them as disrespectful interruptions, they listened carefully to Master Lin's responses, learning not just about Buddhism but about how to handle difficult people with grace. Most remarkably, when Jian avoided his work duties, the other students began volunteering to take on extra tasks, not with resentment, but with genuine compassion for someone who was clearly struggling with his own inner conflicts. They began to see his laziness not as selfishness, but as a symptom of someone who had never learned the joy of serving others. This shift in perspective had an unexpected effect on Jian himself. For months, he had been feeding off the irritation and resentment of his fellow students. Their reactions had confirmed his belief that he was superior to them, that their spiritual practice was shallow and easily disturbed. But as their responses changed, the energy that fueled his disruptive behavior began to dissipate. It's difficult to maintain arrogance when everyone around you responds to your worst behavior with compassion. It's hard to feel superior when people meet your selfishness with generosity. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Jian's rigid defenses began to crack. The breakthrough came on a spring morning when the bamboo grove was alive with new growth. Jian had once again failed to show up for his assigned garden work, leaving the others to weed the vegetable plots alone. But this time, instead of grumbling about his absence, the students worked in peaceful silence, grateful for the opportunity to practice mindfulness while their hands moved among the growing plants. Jian, who had been hiding in the library, ostensibly studying but actually avoiding work, happened to look out the window and see his fellow students bent over the garden beds. For the first time, he really saw them, not as people he needed to impress or outsmart, but as human beings who were quietly carrying his burden without complaint. Something inside him broke open. All his life, he had believed that worth came from being better than others, smarter than others, more important than others. But watching those students tend the garden with such peace and dedication, he realized he had never felt the simple satisfaction of contributing to something larger than himself. Without saying a word, Jian closed his book and walked outside. He knelt beside Chen, picked up a weeding tool, and began working. The other students glanced up in surprise, but they didn't make a big show of welcoming him. They simply made room for him in the row of vegetables. For the first time since arriving at the monastery, Jian worked without trying to prove anything. He just worked, pulling weeds, loosening soil, his hands growing dirty alongside everyone else's. And in that simple shared labor, he discovered something he had been seeking his entire life without knowing it, the feeling of belonging. That evening, Master Lin found Jian sitting alone by the lotus pond, staring at his reflection in the still water. "Master," Jian said without looking up, "I think I understand now why you never asked me to leave, even when everyone wanted you to." "Oh," Master Lin settled beside him on the wooden platform. "What do you understand?" "You saw what I couldn't see, that I needed to learn how to be part of something instead of apart from everything. You knew that the other students needed to learn how to love someone who was hard to love. We were all each other's teachers." Master Lin smiled, the deep, satisfied smile of a gardener whose careful tending has finally produced fruit. And what was the most important lesson? Jian was quiet for a long moment, watching the lotus blossoms bob gently in the evening breeze. "That everyone I meet is showing me something about myself. The people who irritate me are showing me where I still need to grow. The people who challenge me are strengthening my compassion. Even the people who seem to have nothing to teach me are teaching me about humility." This profound understanding is what Buddha meant when he taught that we are all interconnected, that every encounter is an opportunity for mutual awakening. The principle that everyone is your teacher doesn't just apply to wise masters or enlightened beings. It applies most especially to the difficult people, the ones who trigger our impatience, our judgment, our desire to control. In our modern world, this ancient wisdom is more relevant than ever. That coworker who constantly interrupts meetings is teaching you about patience and the art of listening. That family member who always has to be right is showing you how to respond with love instead of arguing. That stranger who cuts you off in traffic is offering you a chance to practice letting go of anger. The key is shifting your perspective from, "Why is this person making my life difficult?" to, "What is this person here to teach me?" This single change in viewpoint transforms every challenging interaction from a source of stress into an opportunity for growth. When someone criticizes you unfairly, instead of getting defensive, you can ask, "Is this teaching me about my attachment to others' opinions?" When someone treats you rudely, instead of taking it personally, you can wonder, "Is this showing me how pain sometimes expresses itself as aggression?" This doesn't mean accepting abuse or failing to set appropriate boundaries. Like the pine tree that bends with the storm but doesn't break, we can be flexible and responsive without being passive victims. Sometimes the teaching requires us to speak up, to protect ourselves, to walk away. But we can do these things from a place of wisdom rather than reactivity, from strength rather than weakness. The beautiful paradox of seeing everyone as your teacher is that it makes you virtually unshakable. When difficult people are no longer enemies to be defeated, but teachers to be learned from, they lose their power to disturb your peace. When challenging situations become opportunities for growth, rather than obstacles to happiness, you discover an inner resilience that nothing can destroy. As you settle deeper into rest tonight, carry with you the image of that ancient pine tree, shaped by storms into something magnificent. Remember that every person who challenges you is offering you the chance to sink deeper roots, to grow stronger, to become more beautiful in your response to life's difficulties. Tomorrow, when you encounter someone who tests your patience, you'll have a choice. You can see them as an enemy of your peace, or as a teacher offering you the exact lesson you need for your growth. In that choice lies the difference between remaining reactive and becoming truly wise, between staying fragile and becoming unshakable. Everyone is your teacher. The question is not whether you'll have difficult people in your life. You will. The question is whether you'll let them teach you or simply frustrate you. In your willingness to learn from everyone, especially the challenging ones, lies one of the most powerful secrets of Buddhist wisdom, that enlightenment comes not from avoiding difficulties, but from allowing them to transform you. Principle 3. Transform envy into inspiration. From the bamboo groves of Master Lin's monastery, our journey now carries us to the bustling marketplaces of ancient India, where the very foundations of Buddhist wisdom were first laid. Here, beneath the scorching sun, and among the calls of merchants hawking their wares, we discover a truth so powerful it can transform one of humanity's most destructive emotions into a force for profound personal growth. This is the story of two monks whose different responses to the same situation would reveal the third principle of becoming unshakable. In the great trading city of Vaishali, where caravans from distant lands converged to exchange silk, spices, and precious gems, stood a modest monastery that served as a refuge for wandering monks. The monastery was simple, just a collection of small wooden huts surrounding a central courtyard, where a single Bodhi tree provided blessed shade from the relentless Indian sun. Unlike the mountain retreats we visited, this monastery existed in the heart of human activity, where the spiritual and material worlds collided daily in a symphony of commerce, ambition, and desire. Two young monks, Tao and Ananda, had arrived at this monastery on the same dusty road, both seeking to deepen their understanding of the Buddha's teachings. They were similar in many ways, both intelligent, both dedicated to their spiritual practice, both having left comfortable family lives to pursue enlightenment. Yet their responses to the world around them would prove to be as different as fire and water. Tao was a serious young man whose shaved head and intense dark eyes reflected his earnest dedication to Buddhist principles. He had memorized vast portions of the sacred texts and could recite complex philosophical arguments with precision that impressed even the monastery's elder monks. His meditation practice was disciplined and rigorous. He would sit motionless for hours, his back straight as a mountain peak, his breathing so controlled it barely stirred the air around him. Yet for all his dedication, there was something rigid about Tao's approach to enlightenment, something that suggested he viewed spiritual progress as a competition to be won, rather than a journey to be experienced. Ananda, by contrast, approached his practice with a lightness that some mistook for lack of seriousness. He laughed easily, asked questions that revealed genuine curiosity rather than desire to impress, and seemed to find wonder in the simplest aspects of monastery life. When he meditated, his face held a gentle smile, as if he were visiting with an old friend. When he studied the texts, he would often pause to gaze out the window, apparently lost in contemplation of how the teachings applied to the bustling life beyond the monastery walls. The monastery's location in the heart of Vaishali meant that the monks regularly encountered the full spectrum of human fortune and misfortune. Wealthy merchants would arrive at the monastery's gates in elaborate palanquins, seeking blessings for their ventures, or offering generous donations in gratitude for successful trades. Their silk robes rustled with every movement, their fingers glittered with rings worth more than most people earned in a lifetime, and their confident bearing spoke of lives lived without material worry. It was the arrival of one such merchant that would test both monks in ways they never anticipated. His name was Vijay, and even by the standards of Vaishali's wealthy traders, he was extraordinarily successful. His caravan stretched for nearly a quarter-mile along the dusty road, dozens of camels loaded with precious goods, guards on horseback with gleaming weapons, servants attending to every conceivable need. Vijay himself rode in a palanquin, so ornate it seemed to capture and reflect the sunlight like a moving jewel. When Vijay approached the monastery to make his customary donation, the contrast between his worldly magnificence and the monk's simple brown robes was almost overwhelming. He stepped from his palanquin wearing robes of the finest silk, dyed in colors so rich they seemed to glow, deep purples that spoke of rare shellfish harvested from distant seas, golds that rivaled the sun itself, blues that captured the depth of twilight skies. Precious stones adorned his fingers, neck, and wrists, each one carefully chosen not just for its beauty, but for its spiritual significance according to ancient traditions. But it wasn't just Vijay's wealth that commanded attention, it was his presence. He moved with the confidence of someone who had never doubted his place in the world, who had turned every challenge into opportunity, every risk into reward. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. Yet there was nothing arrogant about his demeanor, Instead, he radiated the quiet satisfaction of someone who had found his purpose and pursued it with complete dedication. As Vijay described his recent travels to the monastery's elder, both Tao and Ananda found themselves drawn into his stories. He spoke of negotiating with princes in mountain kingdoms where the air was so thin that every breath felt precious. He described crossing deserts where the stars were so brilliant they seemed close enough to pluck from the sky. He told of discovering new trade routes that would bring prosperity to entire regions, of building relationships with merchants whose grandfathers had been conducting business across the same routes for generations. "Next month," Vijay said, his eyes sparkling with anticipation, "I leave for the Spice Islands beyond the Eastern Sea. It's a journey that will take 2 years, but the rewards, both material and spiritual, will be extraordinary. I'll be able to fund 3 new monasteries and provide for 100 families through the employment my ventures create." As Vijay spoke, he reached into a silk pouch and withdrew a handful of gold coins, each one stamped with the seal of a different kingdom. He placed them gently in the monastery's donation bowl, the metal ringing softly against the simple clay. "For the Sangha," he said with a slight bow, "may these humble offerings support your noble work." After Vijay departed in his magnificent caravan, leaving behind only the settling dust and the lingering scent of exotic incense that had clung to his robes, the monastery seemed suddenly smaller, plainer, almost shabby by comparison. The monks' simple brown robes felt rougher against their skin, their basic meals seemed more meager, their modest sleeping quarters appeared cramped and uncomfortable. For Tao, the encounter with Vijay was like a poisoned arrow straight to his heart. As he lay on his thin sleeping mat that night, staring up at the rough wooden ceiling of his tiny cell, his mind churned with bitter thoughts that he couldn't quiet no matter how hard he tried to meditate. "It's not fair," he thought, his jaw clenched with suppressed resentment. "I've given up everything to pursue enlightenment, my family's wealth, my comfortable life, my promising future as a scholar. I spend my days in meditation and study, trying to purify my mind and serve others. Yet this merchant, who spends his time accumulating possessions and pursuing profit, lives like a king while I sleep on the ground." The more Tao thought about the contrast between his austere monk's life and Vijay's opulent existence, the more agitated he became. During morning meditation, instead of focusing on his breath, he found himself imagining what it would feel like to wear silk robes, to travel in a comfortable palanquin, to command the respect that wealth brings. When he tried to study the sacred texts, the words seemed to mock him with their teachings about the illusory nature of material possessions. If possessions are really meaningless, Tao caught himself thinking, then why do I feel so empty without them? If spiritual practice is supposed to bring happiness, why do I feel more miserable than before I became a monk? These thoughts terrified Tao because they contradicted everything he believed about his spiritual path. He had always prided himself on his detachment from worldly concerns, his ability to find contentment in simplicity. But Vijay's visit had revealed that his detachment was shallow, that his contentment depended on not being confronted with attractive alternatives. Day by day, Tao's envy grew like a thorny vine, wrapping itself around his peace and choking out his joy. He became irritable with his fellow monks, critical of the monastery's conditions, resentful toward anyone who seemed happier than he felt. His meditation practice, once a source of deep satisfaction, became a struggle against intrusive thoughts about wealth and comfort. His study of Buddhist texts became an exercise in finding reasons why worldly success was spiritually meaningless, a defensive strategy rather than genuine learning. Ananda, witnessing his friend's transformation, felt deep compassion for Tao's suffering. But Ananda's own response to Vijay's visit had been completely different, and this difference would prove to be the key to understanding how envy can be transformed into inspiration. When Ananda first saw Vijay's magnificent caravan, he felt the same initial stirring of admiration and perhaps a touch of longing that anyone might experience when confronted with such prosperity. But instead of allowing these feelings to ferment into resentment, Ananda examined them with the gentle curiosity that characterized his approach to all mental phenomena. How interesting, he thought to himself, as he watched Vijay's palanquin disappear down the dusty road. I'm feeling attracted to his lifestyle. What exactly is it that I'm admiring? Is it the wealth itself, or something deeper? As Ananda reflected on this question over the following days, he began to realize that what he truly admired about Vijay wasn't the merchant's possessions, but his qualities of character. Vijay had displayed remarkable discipline, the kind of focused dedication that had allowed him to build a vast trading empire from humble beginnings. He had shown courage in his willingness to undertake dangerous journeys to unknown lands. He had demonstrated wisdom in his ability to navigate complex negotiations and build relationships across cultural boundaries. Most importantly, Vijay had exhibited generosity, not just in his donation to the monastery, but in his apparent commitment to using his wealth to benefit others. His mention of funding new monasteries and providing employment showed that his pursuit of prosperity wasn't purely selfish, but included a genuine desire to contribute to the welfare of his community. These are exactly the qualities I want to develop in my spiritual practice, Ananda realized with growing excitement. Discipline, courage, wisdom, generosity. Vijay may be pursuing these through commerce while I pursue them through meditation and study, but the underlying virtues are the same. This insight transformed Ananda's entire relationship with his own spiritual practice. Instead of seeing Vijay as someone who had chosen worldly success over spiritual development, Ananda began to see him as someone who was developing spiritual qualities through worldly means. This perspective didn't make Ananda want to abandon his monastic life, but it did inspire him to approach his practice with renewed energy and purpose. If Vijay could show such discipline in building his business, Ananda reasoned, then surely he could bring that same level of dedication to his meditation practice. If Vijay could be so courageous in facing the dangers of long-distance trade, then Ananda could be equally brave in confronting the difficult emotions and insights that arose during spiritual practice. If Vijay could demonstrate such wisdom in his commercial dealings, then Ananda could apply himself more diligently to understanding the Buddhist teachings. Most transformatively, if Vijay could be so generous with his material wealth, then Ananda could find ways to be equally generous with his spiritual wealth, sharing insights with fellow monks, offering compassion to struggling practitioners, radiating peace to everyone he encountered. The change in Ananda was visible to everyone in the monastery. His meditation became deeper and more focused, inspired by Vijay's example of unwavering concentration on long-term goals. His study of the texts became more thorough and insightful, motivated by Vijay's demonstration of how careful preparation leads to success. His interactions with others became more patient and encouraging, reflecting Vijay's skill in building positive relationships. Within weeks, other monks began seeking out Ananda for guidance and support. His happiness seemed to be contagious, his insights more profound, his presence more calming. Paradoxically, by allowing himself to be inspired by a wealthy merchant's worldly success, Ananda had become a more successful spiritual practitioner. The contrast between the two monks' responses to the same situation illustrates one of Buddhism's most profound teachings about the nature of suffering and happiness. Buddha taught, "Do not be jealous of others' good qualities, but out of admiration, adopt them yourself." This simple instruction contains the key to transforming one of our most painful emotions into one of our most powerful tools for growth. Envy arises when we focus on what others have that we lack, their possessions, their success, their relationships, their apparent happiness. This focus creates a sense of scarcity, a feeling that there isn't enough good fortune to go around, that someone else's gain somehow diminishes our own possibilities. Envy makes us smaller, more bitter, more focused on what's missing from our lives rather than what's present. But when we shift our attention from what others have to how they got it, from their external circumstances to their internal qualities, envy transforms into inspiration. Instead of feeling diminished by others' success, we feel motivated to develop the same virtues that led to their achievements. Instead of seeing their good fortune as evidence of life's unfairness, we see it as proof of what's possible when certain qualities are cultivated and applied. This transformation requires a fundamental shift in how we understand success and happiness. Most envy is based on the assumption that external circumstances determine internal states, that people are happy because they're wealthy, loved because they're attractive, fulfilled because they're successful. But Buddhist wisdom teaches the opposite, that internal qualities create external circumstances, that happiness comes from within and then attracts favorable conditions. When we understand this principle, every person we envy becomes a teacher, showing us which qualities we need to develop. The colleague who gets promoted reveals the importance of dedication and skill. The friend in a happy relationship demonstrates the value of compassion and communication. The neighbor with a beautiful garden shows us what patience and consistent effort can accomplish. Several months after Vijay's visit, the merchant returned to Vaishali. His eastern journey had been even more successful than anticipated, and his caravan was now loaded with spices, silks, and treasures from distant islands. But more than his material wealth, what struck the monks was the change in Vijay himself. He seemed more peaceful, more wise, more deeply content than before. During his visit to the monastery, Vijay shared stories of the challenges he had faced during his journey, storms at sea that had tested his courage, negotiations that had required all his patience and wisdom, moments of doubt when only his discipline had carried him forward. Every difficulty became a teacher, he said. Every obstacle became an opportunity to grow stronger. As Tao listened to these words, something shifted inside him. He realized that Vijay's success hadn't come from luck or privilege, but from the same qualities that Buddhism taught: courage, patience, wisdom, perseverance. The merchant had been following a spiritual path all along, just not in the way Tao had expected. For the first time in months, Tao felt his envy begin to dissolve. In its place arose a new appreciation for his own path and a genuine admiration for Vijay's journey. He began to see that there are many ways to cultivate virtue, many paths to wisdom, many opportunities for growth, and that comparing his path to others had been blocking him from fully embracing his own. Ananda, watching his friend's transformation with joy, approached Tao after Vijay's departure. "What changed?" he asked gently. "I finally understood what you saw from the beginning," Tao replied. "I was so focused on what Vijay had that I couldn't see who he was. His wealth was just the external result of internal qualities, the same qualities we're trying to develop through our practice. Instead of being envious of his success, I should have been inspired by his example." "And now?" Ananda asked. "Now I want to develop that same level of dedication in my meditation, that same courage in facing difficult truths, that same wisdom in understanding the Dharma. Vijay showed me what's possible when these qualities are fully developed. He became my teacher without even knowing it." This story illustrates a truth that can transform every moment of envy into an opportunity for growth. In our modern world, we're constantly exposed to others who seem to have more than we do: more success, more happiness, more love, more recognition. Social media has made this exposure constant and unavoidable, creating endless opportunities for comparison and envy. But each of these moments is also an opportunity to practice the wisdom Ananda discovered. When you see someone's success on social media, instead of focusing on what they have, ask yourself what qualities they must have developed to achieve it. When a colleague gets a promotion you wanted, instead of feeling bitter, consider what skills or attitudes they demonstrated that you could cultivate. When a friend seems happier than you, instead of resenting their joy, observe how they approach life and relationships. This practice transforms envy from a poison that corrodes your peace into a compass that points toward your own growth. Every person you envy becomes a mirror showing you your own potential. Every achievement that stirs your jealousy becomes a map showing you which qualities to develop. The key is remembering that qualities of character, courage, discipline, wisdom, compassion, generosity are not limited resources. One person's development of these virtues doesn't diminish your ability to develop them too. In fact, seeing these qualities expressed successfully in others proves that they're attainable, that the path of growth you're on leads somewhere real and valuable. There's a beautiful paradox in this practice. The more you transform envy into inspiration, the less you need external validation to feel successful. When you're focused on developing your own character, rather than comparing your circumstances to others, you find satisfaction in your growth, regardless of how it measures against others' achievements. You become unshakable because your sense of worth comes from within, rather than from comparison. This doesn't mean becoming complacent or unambitious. Ananda didn't lose his drive to grow spiritually when he stopped envying Vijay. Instead, he became more motivated than ever. But his motivation came from inspiration rather than inadequacy, from love of excellence rather than fear of being left behind. As you rest tonight, bring to mind someone whose success has recently stirred feelings of envy in you. Instead of focusing on what they have that you lack, consider what qualities they must possess to have achieved what they've achieved. Ask yourself, how can I develop these same qualities in my own life, in my own way? Perhaps their success required exceptional dedication. How can you bring that same level of commitment to your own goals? Maybe they showed remarkable courage. Where in your life could you benefit from being braver? Possibly they demonstrated great compassion. How might you express more kindness in your daily interactions? When you wake tomorrow, you'll have a choice in how you respond to others' success. You can let their achievements make you feel smaller, or you can let them inspire you to become larger. You can use their good fortune as evidence that life is unfair, or as proof of what becomes possible when virtue is cultivated and applied. The third principle of becoming unshakable is this: transform every moment of envy into an opportunity for inspiration. See in others' successes not a reason for resentment, but a roadmap for your own development. Let their achievements light the way toward your own growth, rather than casting shadows on your self-worth. In this transformation lies one of the most liberating discoveries of the spiritual path, that everyone you meet is either a teacher showing you something to cultivate, or a mirror reflecting something you've already developed. Either way, every encounter becomes an opportunity for learning. Every comparison becomes a tool for growth. Every feeling of envy becomes a doorway to inspiration. In this way, you become truly unshakable, not because you never feel envy, but because you've learned to alchemize that feeling into gold. Principle 4. Be strict with yourself, gentle with others. Our journey through ancient wisdom now leads us to the misty mountains of Korea, where autumn painted the hillsides in flames of red and gold. Here, in a monastery perched like an eagle's nest on a cliff overlooking valleys thick with ancient pine forests, we encounter a teaching so profound, yet so simple, that it would revolutionize how we see both our own shortcomings and the failings of others. This is the story of Master Haemin and two students whose opposing approaches to self-discipline and compassion would illuminate the fourth principle of unshakable inner strength. The Monastery of Eternal Springs had earned its name from the natural hot springs that bubbled up from deep within the mountain, providing warmth even during the harshest Korean winters. Steam would rise from these sacred pools like incense offerings to the sky, creating an atmosphere of perpetual mystery and renewal. The monastery itself was built in the traditional Korean style, with gracefully curved rooftops that seemed to dance with the mountain mists and wooden buildings that had weathered centuries of seasons while maintaining their quiet dignity. Master Haemin, the monastery's gentle yet formidable teacher, was known throughout Korea for his unusual approach to spiritual instruction. While many masters of his era were stern and demanding, Master Haemin had developed a reputation for seeing into the heart of each student's unique struggles and offering precisely the guidance they needed to overcome their particular obstacles. His eyes, deep-set and kind, seemed to hold both infinite patience and unwavering discernment, as if he could see not just who you were, but who you were capable of becoming. Among his many students were two young monks whose contrasting personalities would provide the perfect laboratory for exploring the delicate balance between self-discipline and compassion. The first was Quan, a perfectionist whose dedication to spiritual practice was matched only by his harsh judgment of anyone who failed to meet his exacting standards. The second was Min-Su, whose kind heart and gentle nature masked a troubling tendency towards self-criticism and personal laxity. Quan had arrived at the monastery with the intensity of someone fleeing from his own imperfections. As the eldest son of a wealthy merchant family, he had been groomed for success from childhood, taught that excellence was not just expected, but mandatory. Every aspect of his upbringing had reinforced the belief that worth was earned through achievement, that love was conditional upon performance, that any failing was a cause for shame. When he decided to become a monk, Quan brought this same merciless drive for perfection to his spiritual practice, but with a twist that made his presence difficult for everyone around him. Quan held himself to impossibly high standards, rising before dawn to meditate for hours, memorizing vast passages of Buddhist texts with machine-like precision, and performing every monastery duty with meticulous attention to detail. His own cell was immaculate, his few possessions arranged with geometric precision, his sleeping mat positioned at exactly the correct angle, his water bowl polished to mirror brightness. He fasted regularly, often skipping meals to demonstrate his detachment from bodily desires, and he could sit in meditation for longer periods than monks with decades more experience. But Quan's perfectionism came with a terrible cost. He applied the same ruthless standards to everyone around him. When a fellow student arrived late to morning meditation, Quan's disapproving glare could be felt across the entire hall. If someone made an error while reciting texts, Quan would correct them with barely concealed irritation. When monastery duties weren't performed to his exacting specifications, he would redo the work himself, making sure others noticed his superior efforts. How can they be so careless with their spiritual practice? Quan would mutter to himself as he swept floors that others had already cleaned, his jaw tight with frustration. Don't they understand that every moment wasted, every duty performed carelessly, every distraction entertained is an obstacle to enlightenment? If they can't even fold their robes properly, how can they hope to achieve liberation from suffering? The other students began to avoid Quan, not out of malice, but out of exhaustion. His constant criticism and implied superiority created an atmosphere of tension that seemed to defeat the very purpose of monastic community. Even his genuine achievements, his profound knowledge of the texts, his impressive meditation skills, his unquestionable dedication, were overshadowed by the uncomfortable feeling that he was keeping score of everyone's spiritual progress and finding them all lacking. Min-Su represented the opposite extreme. Where Quan was harsh with others, Min-Su was endlessly patient and forgiving. He had been raised by grandparents whose unconditional love had taught him to see the best in everyone, to make excuses for others' failings, to offer second and third and fourth chances to anyone who disappointed him. His natural compassion made him beloved by everyone in the monastery. Students sought him out for comfort when they struggled, and even the most difficult personalities seemed to soften in his presence. But Min-Su's gentleness with others was matched by a troubling harshness toward himself. When he made mistakes, arriving late, forgetting a teaching, performing a task imperfectly, he would berate himself with a cruelty that would have shocked anyone who knew only his public kindness. "You're so stupid," he would whisper to himself after stumbling over a passage during group recitation. "Everyone else can remember these teachings, but you can't even pay attention properly. You don't deserve to be here with these dedicated practitioners." While Quan drove himself to excessive achievement, Minsu's self-criticism often paralyzed him into inaction. He would spend so much mental energy berating himself for previous mistakes that he couldn't focus on present tasks. His meditation practice suffered because he was constantly distracted by thoughts of how inadequate his meditation was. His study of the texts was hampered by a voice in his head that insisted he was too simple-minded to understand profound teachings. The irony was that both monks were sabotaging their spiritual progress, just in opposite ways. Quan's criticism of others created barriers to the compassion that is central to Buddhist practice. Minsu's self-criticism created barriers to the self-respect and confidence necessary for genuine spiritual growth. Both were stuck in patterns that seemed virtuous on the surface, but were actually obstacles to enlightenment. Master Harmin observed both students with the patient attention of a gardener, watching seedlings struggle toward the light. He could see that each possessed exactly what the other needed. Quan had the self-discipline that Minsu lacked, while Minsu had the compassion that Quan needed to develop. But simply telling them to change would be useless. They needed to discover the truth through their own experience. The opportunity for this discovery came during the monastery's annual preparation for winter. Each autumn, the entire community would work together to gather firewood, preserve food, repair buildings, and complete all the tasks necessary to survive the harsh mountain winter. It was a time when individual spiritual practice merged with collective responsibility, when the monastery's survival depended on everyone contributing their best efforts. Master Heimin assigned Quan and Minsu to work together on the crucial task of waterproofing the main meditation hall's roof. This job required both technical precision — the tiles had to be positioned exactly right to prevent leaks — and patient cooperation, since two people had to coordinate their movements while balancing on steep, slippery surfaces. From the first morning of their collaboration, the fundamental difference in their approaches became glaringly apparent. Quan approached the task with his characteristic intensity, carefully measuring each tile placement, checking and rechecking every joint, working with the focused determination of someone for whom anything less than perfection was unacceptable. When Minsu made small errors, placing a tile slightly askew, letting his attention wander, working at a pace that Quan considered insufficiently urgent, Quan's frustration became increasingly obvious. "No, no," Quan would say, his voice tight with barely controlled irritation as he repositioned tiles that Minsu had placed. "The measurements have to be exact or the whole section will leak. If we're going to do this job, we need to do it right the first time." His criticism was technically accurate, but delivered with an edge that made Minsu wince and become even more nervous, which led to more mistakes, which increased Quan's frustration in a cycle that seemed destined to explode. Meanwhile, Minsu's internal dialogue was becoming increasingly vicious. "You're ruining everything," he told himself after each correction from Quan. You can't even place roof tiles properly. How pathetic is that? Quan probably thinks you're the most incompetent person he's ever worked with. You should just quit and let someone capable handle this important work. But instead of quitting or defending himself, Minsu did something that revealed the beautiful but misguided nature of his character. When Quan made his own mistakes, dropping tools, miscalculating measurements, struggling with the physical demands of roof work, Minsu immediately offered understanding and support. "Don't worry about it," Minsu would say when Quan fumbled a tile and sent it sliding off the roof. "This is difficult work, and we're both learning. Let me help you with that heavy section." This pattern continued for 3 days, Quan harsh with Minsu's errors but blind to his own, Minsu gentle with Quan's struggles but merciless toward his own failings. The roof work progressed slowly, hampered not by lack of skill but by the emotional atmosphere the two monks had created. Other students began to notice the tension and started avoiding the area where Quan and Minsu were working. On the 4th morning, Master Heyman appeared at the base of the ladder leading to the roof. "Come down, both of you," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that made every student in the monastery stop what they were doing and listen. "I want to show you something." He led them to the monastery's garden, where 2 mirrors had been positioned facing each other among the autumn chrysanthemums. The morning light caught the polished bronze surfaces, creating a complex interplay of reflections that seemed to multiply infinitely. Master Heyman gestured for each monk to stand in front of one of the mirrors. "Quan," the master said, "look into your mirror and tell me what you see." "I see myself, master," Quan replied, though his expression suggested he wasn't sure why this was relevant to their roofing project. "And when you look at that reflection, what do you think?" Quan was silent for a moment, then said quietly, "I see someone who needs to work harder, who could be more disciplined, who has far to go before achieving enlightenment." Master Heyman nodded and turned to Minsu. "And you, Minsu? What do you see in your mirror?" "I see someone who keeps making mistakes," Minsu said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Someone who isn't good enough, who disappoints others, who probably doesn't belong here." "Interesting," Master Harmon said, stroking his beard thoughtfully. "Now, I want you each to look at the other person and tell me what you see." Quan looked at Minsu and said, "I see someone who tries hard but lacks focus and precision. Someone who means well but doesn't apply himself sufficiently to important tasks." Minsu looked at Quan and said, "I see someone who's incredibly dedicated and skilled. Someone who cares deeply about doing things right and has achieved a level of discipline I can only admire." Master Heyman smiled the gentle smile of a teacher whose students were about to discover something important about themselves. "Do you notice anything interesting about these observations?" Both monks looked puzzled, so Master Heyman continued. "Quan, you use your mirror to examine your own faults with ruthless precision, but when you look at Minsu, you see his faults just as clearly. You are strict with yourself and strict with others." He paused to let this sink in. "Minsu, you use your mirror to see only your own inadequacies, but when you look at Quan, you see his strengths and virtues. You are harsh with yourself, but gentle with others." "But Master," Quan protested, "isn't it important to maintain high standards?" Shouldn't we expect excellence from ourselves and others? And Master, Minsu added, isn't it better to be understanding of others' struggles? Shouldn't we be compassionate toward people who are trying their best? Master Heyman picked up a small pebble from the garden path and tossed it into the reflection pool beside the mirrors. The ripples distorted both reflections, making them waver and change. Watch how the water responds to the stone, he said. Does it become angry at the disturbance? Does it criticize the stone for disrupting its perfect surface? No, Master, both students replied. The water simply accepts the disturbance and gradually returns to stillness. But notice, the water doesn't become chaotic or lose its essential nature because of the ripples. It remains water, clear and pure, even while adapting to the stone's impact. He gestured for them to sit on the wooden bench beside the pool. True spiritual strength comes from being like this water, maintaining your own clarity and purity while accepting that others may create ripples in your environment. This means being strict with yourself, maintaining your own standards, your own discipline, your own commitment to growth, while being gentle with others, understanding that they are at different points in their journey and may disturb your peace as they learn. But how do we know when to be strict and when to be gentle? Kwan asked, his voice reflecting genuine confusion. The key, Master Heyman replied, is understanding what you can and cannot control. You can control your own thoughts, your own actions, your own responses to situations. Therefore, you can and should hold yourself to high standards in these areas. But you cannot control others' thoughts, actions, or responses. Therefore, expecting them to meet your standards will only lead to frustration and conflict. He pointed to the roof they had been working on. When you make a mistake placing a tile, Kwan, you should indeed notice it quickly and correct it immediately. That's being properly strict with yourself. But when Minsu makes a mistake, your job is not to judge him or correct him harshly, but to respond with the same patience you would want to receive if you were learning something new. And Minsu, he continued, when you make a mistake, you should acknowledge it calmly and learn from it without the harsh self-criticism that only makes you more likely to repeat the error. That's being properly strict with yourself, holding yourself accountable without being cruel. But you should continue to show others the same compassion you naturally feel, understanding that everyone is struggling in their own way. Buddha taught, you yourself, as much as anybody in the entire universe, deserve your love and affection. This teaching reveals the heart of the fourth principle, that true spiritual strength comes from applying high standards to yourself while extending compassion to others. It's about taking full responsibility for your own growth while allowing others the space to learn at their own pace. Master Heyman stood and walked to a nearby tree whose branches were heavy with autumn leaves. He picked up a fallen leaf and held it gently in his palm. This leaf fell because it was ready to fall, he said. The tree didn't push it off for being imperfect, and the leaf didn't cling desperately to the branch because it feared judgment. Everything happened in its natural time, according to natural law. Your spiritual practice should be the same way. Be like the tree, rooted firmly in your own values and discipline, growing steadily toward the light, but allowing others to develop according to their own natural timing. Don't try to force others to grow faster than they're ready for, and don't abandon your own growth because others seem to be progressing more slowly. The following day, Kwan and Min-soo returned to their roofing work with dramatically different attitudes. Kwan still maintained his high standards for his own work, checking each tile carefully and taking pride in precise measurements. But when Min-soo made errors, instead of criticizing, Kwan would simply say, "Let me show you a technique that might help," or "This part is tricky. I had trouble with it too when I was learning." Min-soo, meanwhile, began catching his own mistakes more quickly and correcting them without the internal barrage of self-criticism. "That tile needs to be repositioned," he would say to himself matter-of-factly, the same way he might observe that a cloud was passing overhead. No drama, no self-flagellation, just calm acknowledgement and correction. The change in their working dynamic was remarkable. The roof work progressed more quickly and smoothly than before, but more importantly, both monks felt energized rather than drained by their collaboration. Other students began gravitating toward their work area again, drawn by the atmosphere of focused calm that had replaced the previous tension. Within a week, their transformation extended far beyond the roofing project. Kwan's relationships with his fellow students improved dramatically as he learned to see their struggles with compassion rather than judgment. His own spiritual practice became more joyful and sustainable as he maintained discipline without the harsh self-criticism that had previously driven him. Min-soo's practice deepened as he learned to hold himself accountable without cruelty. His natural compassion for others remained intact, but now he extended that same kindness to himself. His meditation became more focused, his study more effective, his service to the community more confident and skilled. Several months later, Master Heyman called both students to join him for evening tea. As they sat together watching the sun set behind the mountain peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the master asked them to reflect on what they had learned. "I learned that being strict with myself doesn't require being harsh with others," Kwan said thoughtfully. "In fact, when I stopped judging everyone else's performance, I became much better at maintaining my own standards. It's like I had been using so much energy criticizing others that I didn't have enough left for my own growth." Min-soo nodded and added, "And I learned that being gentle with others doesn't require being cruel to myself. I can hold myself to reasonable standards and correct my mistakes without all the self-hatred that used to paralyze me. It turns out that treating myself with the same kindness I show others actually makes me more effective, not less." Master Heyman smiled with the deep satisfaction of a teacher whose students have grasped not just the technique, but the spirit of an important teaching. "You have discovered one of the most liberating truths of the spiritual path," he said. "That real strength comes not from being hard or soft, but from knowing when to be firm and when to be flexible. Like bamboo that bends in strong winds but doesn't break, like water that is soft enough to flow around obstacles, but persistent enough to carve canyons through stone." This principle transforms how we navigate every relationship and challenge in our lives. In our modern world, we often fall into the same traps that Kwan and Min-soo experienced. Some of us become harsh critics of everyone around us, while making excuses for our own failings. Others become so focused on being understanding toward others that we lose all accountability for our own growth and behavior. The Buddhist path offers a wiser way, taking complete responsibility for our own thoughts, emotions, and actions, while extending patience and compassion to others as they navigate their own learning process. This means noticing when we're being lazy or undisciplined with ourselves and correcting course immediately, while also recognizing that others' apparent laziness or lack of discipline might reflect struggles we can't see or understand. When your co-worker consistently arrives late to meetings, instead of judging their character, you can wonder what challenges they might be facing, while ensuring that you yourself are always punctual. When a family member repeatedly makes the same mistakes, instead of lecturing them, you can offer support while making sure you're learning from your own errors. When a friend seems to be making poor choices, instead of trying to control their decisions, you can be available to help while focusing your energy on making wise choices in your own life. This principle also applies to how we handle our own mistakes and shortcomings. Being strict with yourself doesn't mean being cruel or perfectionistic. It means holding yourself accountable with the same firmness and compassion you would use with a beloved friend who was struggling. It means acknowledging errors quickly and completely while maintaining faith in your ability to learn and grow. When you make a mistake at work, you can acknowledge it fully, take steps to correct it, and implement systems to prevent similar errors in the future, all without the internal narrative of shame and self-attack that only makes future mistakes more likely. When you fall short of your own standards in relationships, you can apologize sincerely, change your behavior, and recommit to treating others with love, without drowning in guilt that serves no constructive purpose. The practical application of this principle requires constant mindfulness and the willingness to catch yourself when you slip into old patterns. Throughout each day, you can ask yourself, am I taking appropriate responsibility for my own thoughts and actions? Am I extending appropriate compassion to others as they navigate their own challenges? This isn't about keeping score or achieving perfect balance, but about developing the wisdom to know when firmness serves growth and when gentleness serves healing. Sometimes being strict with yourself means pushing through resistance to do something difficult but important. Other times it means being honest about your limitations and asking for help. Sometimes being gentle with others means offering encouragement and support. Other times, it means setting boundaries to protect your own well-being. The beautiful result of practicing this principle is that you become unshakable in a very specific way. Your sense of worth and peace no longer depends on others' behavior or approval. When you're focused on maintaining your own integrity while accepting others' imperfections, you develop an inner stability that external circumstances can't destroy. You become like Master Haemon's reflection pool, capable of returning to stillness, regardless of what stones others might throw into your environment. As you prepare for sleep tonight, bring to mind a relationship where you've been either too harsh with someone else or too lenient with yourself. Consider how you might apply this principle tomorrow. What would it look like to take fuller responsibility for your own growth while extending greater compassion to the other person's struggles? Perhaps there's someone whose behavior has been frustrating you. Instead of trying to change them, you could focus on responding to their actions with wisdom and patience, while ensuring that your own behavior reflects your highest values. Or maybe there's an area where you've been making excuses for your own lack of progress. You could commit to honest self-improvement, while treating yourself with the same kindness you'd show a good friend who was facing similar challenges. The fourth principle of becoming unshakable is this: be your own strictest teacher and everyone else's most compassionate friend. Hold yourself accountable with loving firmness, while holding others with patient understanding. In this balance between self-discipline and compassion lies the secret to relationships that energize, rather than drain you, to personal growth that feels sustainable rather than punishing, to inner peace that remains stable regardless of how imperfectly the people around you behave. Tomorrow, you'll have countless opportunities to practice this wisdom, moments when others disappoint you, and when you disappoint yourself. In each of these moments, you can choose to respond with the balanced strength that Buddha taught, taking full ownership of your part while extending grace to others as they learn theirs. This choice, repeated consistently, becomes the foundation of a life that is both disciplined and compassionate, both strong and gentle, both unshakable and infinitely loving. Principle 5. No one can hurt you without your permission. Deep in the heart of Myanmar, where ancient temples rise like prayers carved in stone and the Irrawaddy River flows like liquid gold in the evening light, we encounter perhaps the most challenging yet liberating truth in all of Buddhist teaching. This is the story of a monk whose encounter with genuine danger would reveal that the greatest strength lies not in avoiding harm, but in understanding what can and cannot truly be harmed within us. Prepare yourself for a journey that will forever change how you understand your own invulnerability. The year was 1287, and the great kingdom of Pagan was crumbling under the weight of political upheaval and foreign invasion. Across the land, temples that had stood for centuries were being abandoned, monks were fleeing to safer regions, and the ancient order that had maintained peace for generations was dissolving into chaos. Yet in this time of terror and uncertainty, one monastery continued to function as if nothing had changed, not out of ignorance of the danger, but out of a profound understanding of what danger actually means. The monastery of the Golden Lotus sat perched on a hill, overlooking a strategic river crossing, making it impossible to ignore the constant stream of refugees fleeing southward, their carts loaded with whatever possessions they could carry, their faces etched with the particular exhaustion that comes from losing everything you thought was permanent. Soldiers from various factions would pass through the area regularly, some maintaining discipline and order, others little better than bandits taking advantage of the chaos to enrich themselves through theft and intimidation. Within this monastery lived a monk named Thura, whose very name meant courageous in the ancient language, though his courage was of a type that most people would not recognize as such. Thura was not physically imposing. He was slight of build, soft-spoken, and possessed the kind of gentle demeanor that might make him seem an easy target to those who measured strength by the ability to intimidate others. But Thura had spent 15 years studying and practicing the deepest teachings of Buddhism, and in those teachings he had discovered something that made him essentially invulnerable, not to physical harm, but to the fear and spiritual damage that such harm is meant to inflict. Unlike many of his brother monks who had fled to safer regions when the political situation deteriorated, Thura had chosen to remain at the monastery, continuing his daily routine of meditation, study, and service to the local community as if the world around him was not falling apart. This wasn't foolish denial of reality. Thura was fully aware of the dangers surrounding him. Rather, it was the expression of a profound understanding about the nature of harm and safety that would soon be tested in the most direct way possible. The test came on a morning when the autumn mist still clung to the river valley like a silk scarf, muffling sound and creating an atmosphere of unreality that seemed appropriate for what was about to unfold. Thura was walking the forest path to the village below, carrying his alms bowl as he had every morning for years, when he encountered a band of deserters from various armies who had turned to banditry as their means of survival. There were 5 of them, armed with swords and spears, their clothes a mixture of military gear and stolen finery that marked them as men who had abandoned any pretense of honor or discipline. Their leader was a heavy-set man with scars across his face and hands that spoke of many violent encounters, his eyes holding the particular hardness that comes from having done things that once seemed unthinkable. When they spotted Thura approaching alone on the forest path, they saw what appeared to be perfect prey, a solitary monk with no protection, no weapons, and presumably access to whatever wealth the monastery might contain. "Stop right there, monk," the leader called out, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of someone accustomed to being obeyed through fear. "We're having a difficult time lately, and we think your monastery should help us out. Tell us where you keep your gold, your jewels, whatever valuable donations the faithful have given you." Thura paused on the path and looked at the 5 armed men with an expression that contained no fear, no anger, no calculation about escape routes or defensive strategies. Instead, his face held something that the bandits had never seen in any of their previous victims, a kind of gentle curiosity, as if he were encountering an interesting natural phenomenon rather than a life-threatening situation. "Good morning, friends," Thura said, his voice as calm and warm as if he were greeting visitors at the monastery gate. "I can see that you're struggling, and I wish I could help you in the way you're requesting. But our monastery has no treasures to give. We own nothing beyond the simplest necessities for our practice and service." The bandit leader's face darkened with anger at what he perceived as defiance disguised as politeness. "Don't lie to us, monk. We know how these places work. Rich devotees bring you offerings of gold and precious stones. You live like kings while pretending to be holy men." He took a step closer, his hand moving to the hilt of his sword. "Tell us where the treasure is hidden, or we'll make you tell us." What happened next would be remembered and retold for generations, not because it was dramatic in the way that stories of heroic battles are dramatic, but because it revealed something about human nature that most people never discover, the difference between what can be threatened and what is truly invulnerable. Thura looked directly into the bandit leader's eyes with an expression of such complete peace that it was almost startling in the context of the threatening situation. "My friend," he said gently, "you can certainly harm this body if you choose to. You can take my life, cause me physical pain, destroy anything material that I might possess. But you cannot touch what is most essential about me unless I give you permission to do so." "What are you talking about?" the bandit demanded, confusion creeping into his voice alongside the anger. "Are you trying to confuse us with your religious nonsense?" "Not at all," Thura replied, settling into a cross-legged position on the forest path as naturally as if he were beginning his morning meditation. I'm simply telling you the truth about what you can and cannot accomplish through violence. You can hurt my body, but you cannot hurt my peace unless I choose to abandon it. You can threaten my life, but you cannot damage my spirit unless I give you that power over me. The bandits exchanged confused glances. They were accustomed to victims who begged, who offered bribes, who tried to negotiate or escape. They had never encountered someone who responded to threats with what appeared to be a philosophy lesson. One of the younger bandits raised his spear menacingly. "Stop talking in riddles. We want treasure, not a sermon." Thura nodded understandingly. "I know you want treasure, and I truly wish I could provide what you're seeking. But I want to share something with you that might be even more valuable than gold or jewels." He paused, looking at each of the 5 men with genuine compassion. "Right now, you believe that your survival and happiness depend on taking things from others by force. But this belief is causing you more suffering than any external enemy could inflict." "How dare you?" the leader began, but Thura continued speaking in the same calm, conversational tone. "Think about your life since you began this path of taking from others," Thura said. "Are you happier now than you were before? Do you sleep peacefully at night? Do you trust the men beside you, or do you constantly worry that they might betray you for a larger share of the spoils? Are you at peace, or are you always looking over your shoulder, always ready for the next fight, always afraid that someone stronger will do to you what you do to others?" The questions hit their target with surprising accuracy. The bandit leader's face tightened as he recognized uncomfortable truths in Thura's words. Life as a brigand was indeed a constant state of vigilance, suspicion, and fear disguised as aggression. But admitting this to a monk he was trying to rob felt like an unbearable weakness. "That's none of your business," he snarled, drawing his sword partway from its sheath. "We're not here for your advice. Give us what we want, or suffer the consequences." Thura's expression remained unchanged, neither fearful nor defiant, but filled with something that seemed almost like sadness for the bandit's situation, rather than concern for his own. "The consequences you're threatening are only painful if I resist them," he said simply. "If you choose to harm this body, I will not fight you or hate you for it. If you choose to end this life, I will not spend my final moments in fear or anger. You can take my possessions, but I have already given them up. You can threaten my future, but I am completely present in this moment. What power do you actually have over someone who wants nothing from you and fears nothing you can do?" The question hung in the morning air, like the mist that still clung to the trees around them. For the first time in their criminal careers, the bandits were facing someone who seemed genuinely unaffected by their threats. The very foundation of their power, the ability to create fear, was proving useless against this calm monk, who spoke to them as if they were old friends, having a philosophical discussion rather than armed men planning violence. Buddha's teaching echoed through Thura's words. No one saves us but ourselves. No one can, and no one may. We ourselves must walk the path. What Thura understood, what the bandits were struggling to comprehend, was that true invulnerability comes not from being too strong to be harmed, but from being too free to be controlled by the fear of harm. "You're insane," one of the younger bandits muttered. but his voice lacked conviction. There was something unsettling about threatening someone who seemed genuinely unafraid, who appeared to mean exactly what he said about accepting whatever they chose to do. Perhaps, Thura agreed with a slight smile. But consider this, which of us is truly free right now? You carry weapons because you're afraid of being defenseless. You travel in a group because you're afraid of being alone. You take from others because you're afraid of having nothing. I sit here with no weapons, no companions, no possessions worth stealing, and I fear none of the things you fear. Who is the prisoner and who is free? The bandit leader felt something crack inside his chest, not physically but emotionally, as if Thura's words had reached through all his armor and touched something he had thought was safely buried. He had spent years building an identity around being dangerous, around being someone others feared, around taking what he wanted through force. But facing someone who was genuinely unintimidated by his threats, he suddenly felt the hollowness of that identity, the way it depended entirely on others' fear for its power. "Stop talking," he said, but the command came out more like a plea than an order. Just tell us where the treasure is so we can be done with this." Thura's voice remained gentle, but it carried an unmistakable note of finality. "There is no treasure in the sense you mean, my friend. The only wealth our monastery contains is the understanding that happiness cannot be stolen from others, and peace cannot be found through violence. These are treasures that can only be discovered within yourself, and no one can take them from you once you truly possess them." He stood up slowly, brushing dust from his robes, with the unhurried movements of someone who was completely present in the moment. "You can search our buildings if you wish. You'll find rice, simple tools, worn books, sleeping mats. You can harm me if that will somehow serve your purposes. But I cannot give you what you're really looking for, because what you're really looking for can only be found through understanding rather than acquisition." The bandits stood in confused silence, their weapons still drawn but their purpose somehow deflated. They had encountered something they had no framework for understanding, genuine fearlessness that arose not from courage in the heroic sense, but from a complete absence of attachment to anything that could be threatened. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few minutes, the bandit leader slowly resheathed his sword. "This is pointless," he said to his companions, though his voice lacked its earlier aggression. "There's nothing here worth taking." As the bandits began to move away, one of them, the youngest, who couldn't have been more than 20, turned back to look at Thura. "Monk," he called out, "what you said about peace, how does someone find it when they've done things they can't undo?" Thura's face lit up with genuine warmth. "The same way anyone finds it," he said. "By understanding that what you've done is not who you are, and that every moment offers a new choice about who you want to become. The path of peace is always available, regardless of where the path of violence has led." The young bandit nodded once, a gesture that seemed to contain both gratitude and a kind of desperate hope, before hurrying to catch up with his companions as they disappeared into the forest. Thura remained standing on the path for several minutes after they left, not from any lingering fear or shock, but simply to allow the encounter to settle into his consciousness as completely as possible. He had just lived through one of the most fundamental demonstrations of Buddhist teaching, that suffering comes not from external circumstances, but from our resistance to and attachment regarding those circumstances. The bandits had intended to create suffering through threats and violence, but they had discovered that their power existed only when their targets shared their belief in the importance of material security and physical safety. Thura's genuine detachment from these concerns, not as a philosophical concept, but as a lived reality, had rendered their threats meaningless. He could not be controlled through fear because he was not afraid. He could not be robbed because he owned nothing he was attached to keeping. He could not be diminished because his sense of worth came from sources they could not touch. When Thura returned to the monastery that evening and shared his experience with the other monks, they were amazed not by his bravery, but by his clarity. He had not faced down the bandits through force of will or heroic courage, but through the simple application of understanding that had taken years to develop. He had demonstrated that the deepest teaching of Buddhism is not theoretical but practical, that freedom from suffering is possible not through changing external circumstances, but through changing our relationship to those circumstances. This profound truth applies to every form of harm that others might try to inflict upon us. In our modern world, we face different threats than armed bandits, but the principle remains the same. When someone tries to hurt us with harsh words, their power over us depends entirely on our attachment to their opinion. When someone attempts to manipulate us through guilt or fear, their success requires our participation in the emotional drama they're creating. When someone tries to diminish our sense of worth through criticism or rejection, they can only succeed if we derive our self-value from their approval. The liberating truth that Thura embodied is that no one can make you feel inferior, worthless, afraid, or diminished without your unconscious cooperation. This doesn't mean that others can't create difficult circumstances, cause physical discomfort, or interfere with your plans. It means that your inner peace, your sense of worth, your fundamental happiness, these remain under your control, regardless of what others do or say. Consider how this applies to common situations in daily life. When someone criticizes your work unfairly, they can affect your external circumstances, but not your inner knowledge of your own competence and worth. When someone tries to make you feel guilty for setting boundaries, they can create temporary discomfort, but not genuine guilt, unless you believe you're doing something wrong. When someone attempts to intimidate you into compliance, they can create external pressure, but not internal submission, unless you choose to value their approval over your own integrity. The practice of this principle requires developing what Buddhists call detachment, not indifference or emotional numbness, but freedom from the compulsive need to have circumstances be different than they are. It means cultivating sources of security, worth, and happiness that are independent of others' actions and opinions. It means recognizing that your true self, your consciousness, your capacity for love, your essential nature, cannot be damaged by external events, no matter how painful or traumatic they might be. This understanding doesn't make you passive or resigned to poor treatment. Thura could have chosen to fight the bandits, flee from them, or attempt to negotiate with them, and any of these responses might have been appropriate depending on the circumstances. What made him unshakable was not his specific actions, but his inner freedom from fear and attachment. From this place of inner freedom, he could respond to threats with wisdom, rather than react from fear, pain, or ego. In practical terms, this principle allows you to set boundaries without anger, to receive criticism without defensiveness, to face uncertainty without anxiety, and to encounter hostility without hatred. When you truly understand that others cannot harm your essential self without your permission, you become capable of responding to all situations from a place of strength and clarity, rather than reactivity and fear. The young bandit who asked about finding peace after having done things that can't be undone represents all of us who carry guilt, shame, or regret about past actions. Thora's response reveals another aspect of this principle, that even the harm we've inflicted on ourselves through poor choices cannot permanently damage our essential nature. The path to peace is always available because our true self exists beyond our history of mistakes and achievements alike. Several years later, that young bandit appeared at the monastery of the Golden Lotus, having left his life of violence and seeking to understand the peace he had glimpsed in his brief encounter with Thora. He became one of the monastery's most dedicated students, eventually becoming a teacher himself who specialized in helping others who had lived through violence and trauma. His transformation demonstrated that the principle of inner invulnerability applies not just to receiving harm, but to recovering from harm we've already experienced or inflicted. As you settle into rest tonight, consider the areas of your life where you've been giving others power over your inner peace. Perhaps it's a family member whose approval you seek, a co-worker whose criticism affects your mood, or a friend whose judgment influences your self-worth. Notice how much mental and emotional energy you spend trying to control others' reactions to you, trying to prevent them from doing or saying things that might hurt your feelings. Tomorrow, you'll have opportunities to practice this profound truth, moments when someone says something harsh, acts inconsiderately, or tries to manipulate your emotions. In each of these moments, you can remember Thora's example and ask yourself, what is this person actually capable of damaging within me? What am I giving them permission to affect that I could choose to keep under my own control? The fifth principle of becoming unshakable is this: no one can hurt you without your permission. Others may create difficult circumstances, but they cannot create suffering within you unless you cooperate with their intentions through fear, attachment, or resistance. Your inner peace belongs to you alone, and you can choose to maintain it regardless of how others choose to behave. This doesn't mean becoming emotionally numb or pretending that painful experiences don't affect you. It means understanding the difference between pain and suffering. Pain is often unavoidable, but suffering is optional. Pain is what happens to you. Suffering is what you do with what happens to you. In this distinction lies the secret of genuine invulnerability, not the inability to be affected by life, but the ability to remain centered and peaceful, regardless of what life brings. Rest now in the knowledge that your essential self is beyond the reach of anyone who might wish you harm. Like Thora sitting peacefully on that forest path, you possess an inner sanctuary that no external force can violate without your consent. Tomorrow, when you encounter those who would disturb your peace, you can choose to respond from this place of inner freedom, rather than react from fear or need. In this choice lies the difference between being a victim of circumstances and being the master of your own inner world. Principle 6. The power of acceptance. In the fertile river valley of ancient Cambodia, where the mighty Mekong carved its path through landscapes of impossible green, we discover a teaching that reveals the paradox at the heart of all transformation. Here, in a region where monsoon floods could change the entire geography overnight, lived a farmer whose response to catastrophic loss would illuminate one of Buddhism's most misunderstood yet powerful principles. This is the story of how true strength is found, not in fighting what has already happened, but in embracing it so completely that it becomes the foundation for something even more beautiful. The village of Prey Veng sat nestled between rice paddies that stretched toward the horizon like a green sea, their surface broken only by the occasional sugar palm rising like a ship's mast against the endless sky. For generations, the families here had lived in harmony with the river's rhythms, understanding that the same waters that brought life-giving nutrients to their crops could also bring destruction when the rains were too heavy or came at the wrong time. It was a landscape that taught its inhabitants the deepest lessons about impermanence, though not everyone learned those lessons with equal grace. Among the village's most respected residents was a man named Chandra, whose family had farmed the same plot of land for over 2 centuries. His great-great-grandfather had first cleared the forest here, building the intricate system of dikes and channels that controlled the flow of water through the paddies with an engineering precision that would have impressed the builders of Angkor Wat. Each generation had added to this legacy, new terraces carved into hillsides, improved irrigation systems, fruit orchards planted with varieties selected over decades for their resilience and productivity. By the time Chandra inherited this land, it had become something approaching perfection in its adaptation to the local environment. His rice yields were among the highest in the region. His fruit trees produced abundant harvests that fed not just his own large extended family, but provided surplus for trade with neighboring villages. The farm was a living testament to what human patience and wisdom could accomplish when working in partnership with natural forces rather than against them. But Chandra's wealth was not measured only in agricultural productivity. Over the years, he had used the proceeds from his successful farming to build one of the finest houses in the village, a graceful structure of teak and bamboo, raised high on stilts to protect against seasonal flooding, its wraparound verandas offering views across the rice fields that seemed to extend forever. The house was filled with beautiful objects accumulated over a lifetime, carved furniture, crafted by master artisans, silk textiles in colors that caught and held light like captured rainbows, bronze Buddha statues that seemed to radiate peace into every room. More precious than any material possession, though, was the life Chandra had built within these walls. He and his wife had raised 5 children here, watching them grow from toddlers, taking their first steps on the polished wooden floors, to adults contributing their own labor and wisdom to the family enterprise. The house had witnessed countless celebrations, harvest festivals where the entire village would gather to share food and stories, wedding ceremonies that lasted for days, births that brought joy echoing through every room. It was, by any measure, a life of extraordinary success and contentment. Chandra often said that he felt blessed by the gods, that his good fortune was beyond what any man had a right to expect. He was known throughout the region, not just for his prosperity, but for his generosity. During difficult years, he would share his surplus with struggling neighbors, and his home was always open to travelers who needed shelter. Yet Chandra's contentment was about to face the ultimate test, in a way that would reveal whether his peace was truly deep or merely dependent on favorable circumstances. The monsoon season of 1432 began normally enough. The rains arrived on schedule, filling the rivers and flooding the rice paddies in the ancient rhythm that had sustained life in this region for thousands of years. Chandra watched with satisfaction as his rice plants turned the fields into a carpet of vibrant green, their growth vigorous and healthy in the rich, muddy water. But as the weeks passed, it became clear that this year was different. The rains continued long past their usual stopping point, growing heavier rather than lighter as the season progressed. The river began to rise beyond its normal flood stage, first gradually, then with alarming speed. Village elders who had lived through 8 decades of monsoons shook their heads in bewilderment. They had never seen water levels like this. Chandra and his neighbors worked frantically to reinforce their dikes and channels, hauling baskets of earth and stones in a desperate attempt to direct the rising waters away from their homes and fields. For 3 days and nights, the entire village labored together, men and women, young and old, fighting against a force that seemed determined to reclaim the land that human ingenuity had wrestled from its control. On the 4th night, as Chandra stood on his veranda watching the water creep ever higher up the support posts of his house, he realized that their efforts had been futile. The river had risen beyond anything their ancestors had planned for, beyond anything their traditional methods could handle. In a few hours, the flood would reach the floor of his house. By morning, everything he had spent his life building might be underwater. His wife found him there as dawn broke, sitting in meditation posture on the wooden planks, his eyes closed, his breathing deep and regular, despite the chaos surrounding them. "Chandra," she said urgently, "we need to evacuate. The water will be inside the house within the hour. We need to save what we can and get to higher ground." Chandra opened his eyes and looked at his wife with an expression that surprised her with its serenity. "Yes," he said calmly, "we should gather the family and move to safety. But first, I want to watch this happen. I want to see it clearly, without fighting it or denying it." "Watch what happened?" she asked, confusion evident in her voice. "The flood," he said simply. "Our life changing. Everything we've built being transformed into something else. I want to accept it completely so that I can respond to what comes next with wisdom rather than bitterness." And so, as his neighbors ran frantically to save their possessions, as families loaded carts with whatever they could carry, as the village erupted in the chaos of emergency evacuation, Chandra sat peacefully on his veranda and watched the flood claim his life's work. He watched as the water reached the floor of his house and began to spread across the rooms where his children had played, where his family had shared thousands of meals, where he had experienced some of the happiest moments of his life. He watched as his beautiful furniture began to float, as his silk textiles were soaked and ruined, as his bronze Buddha statues disappeared beneath the muddy water. He watched as the rice fields that had fed his family for generations vanished beneath a brown sea that reflected the gray sky like a mirror of destruction. But something remarkable happened as Chandra witnessed this catastrophe. Instead of feeling the crushing despair that might be expected from someone losing everything, he found himself filled with an unexpected sense of liberation. As each possession disappeared beneath the water, as each familiar landmark was transformed beyond recognition, he felt something heavy lifting from his chest, something he hadn't even realized he had been carrying. "Look," he said to his wife, who had joined him in watching their world transform. "Look how the water doesn't fight against anything. It doesn't argue with the land about where it should go, or complain that the houses are in its way. It simply flows where the land allows it to flow, accepting the shape of whatever contains it." His wife stared at him in amazement. "How can you be so calm? We've lost everything, our home, our crops, all our possessions. Don't you feel anything about what's happening?" Chandra was quiet for a long moment, watching a wooden chest that had belonged to his grandfather float past the veranda like a boat without a sailor. "I feel everything," he said finally. "I feel sadness for the loss of beautiful things. I feel concern about how we'll rebuild our lives. I feel uncertainty about what comes next." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But I don't feel resistance to what has already happened. The flood is here. Our house is flooded. Our crops are destroyed. These are simply facts now, like the fact that the sun rises in the east. I can accept these facts and put my energy into responding wisely, or I can resist them and waste my energy fighting against something that has already occurred." Buddha taught, accept what is, let go of what was, and have faith in what will be. In this moment of devastating loss, Chandra was embodying this teaching not as a philosophical concept, but as a lived reality. He was discovering that acceptance is not passive resignation, but the foundation of all effective action. As the water continued to rise, Chandra and his family evacuated to a Buddhist temple on higher ground, joining dozens of other flood refugees in the simple wooden building that had become a temporary shelter. The contrast between their current circumstances and their comfortable life of just a few days earlier could hardly have been more stark. They slept on thin mats on the temple floor, ate simple rice porridge prepared by the monks, and wore whatever clothes they had managed to save from the flood. But while other refugees spent their days lamenting their losses, Chandra seemed to approach their situation with a curious sense of anticipation. "This is interesting," he would say to his wife as they watched other families arguing about who was to blame for their situation or complaining about the inadequate conditions in their temporary shelter. "We have an opportunity here that we've never had before." "What opportunity?" she asked, genuinely puzzled by her husband's attitude. "The opportunity to start fresh," he replied. "For 30 years, I've been managing and maintaining and expanding what my ancestors built. It was good work, and I'm grateful for it, but it was also constraining in ways I didn't recognize. Every decision I made had to account for what already existed, had to fit into patterns that were established long before I was born." He gestured toward the window, where the floodwaters stretched to the horizon. "Now we have a blank canvas. When the water recedes, we can rebuild in whatever way serves us best, not just maintain what has always been. We can design a farm that's even better adapted to this environment. We can build a house that better reflects what we've learned about how we want to live. We can create something new instead of just preserving something old." His enthusiasm was infectious. Within days, other flood refugees began gathering around Chandra each evening, drawn by his ability to see possibility where they saw only loss. Instead of dwelling on what the flood had taken away, they began planning what they would create when it was over. My old rice paddies were too small, one farmer realized. When I rebuild, I can combine several plots into larger, more efficient fields. I always wanted to try growing different crops, another added. Now I can experiment with varieties I was afraid to risk before. My house was beautiful, but it was also too big for our family's current needs, a village elder admitted. We can build something more appropriate for who we are now, not who we were 20 years ago. What began as informal evening conversations gradually evolved into organized planning sessions. The flood refugees, guided by Chandra's perspective that acceptance opens the door to creativity, began designing an entirely new approach to village life. They would rebuild not just what they had lost, but something better, a community that was more resilient to flooding, more efficient in its use of land and water, more beautiful in its integration with the natural environment. 3 months later, when the floodwaters finally receded, what emerged was indeed a blank canvas. The landscape had been completely transformed. Old field boundaries had been erased. Familiar landmarks had disappeared. The very topography had been reshaped by the massive movement of water and sediment. To most people, it would have looked like a scene of utter devastation. To Chandra and his fellow villagers, it looked like opportunity made manifest. They began rebuilding with an energy and enthusiasm that amazed visiting officials who came to assess the flood damage. Instead of trying to recreate what had been lost, they implemented the plans they had developed during their months of forced exile. The new village that emerged was indeed more beautiful, more functional, and more resilient than what the flood had destroyed. Chandra's new house was smaller than his old one, but more elegantly designed, with better ventilation, more natural light, and a layout that encouraged family interaction. His new farm was more productive than the old one, incorporating innovative water management techniques and crop rotation methods that the planning sessions had identified. More importantly, his new life felt more authentic, more aligned with his actual values rather than inherited expectations. But the most profound transformation was in Chandra himself. The experience of losing everything and discovering that he was not only okay but somehow liberated by the loss had given him a different relationship with all possessions and achievements. He worked just as diligently as before, cared for his family just as devotedly, contributed to his community just as generously. But he held it all more lightly, with the understanding that everything he built was temporary and that his happiness was not dependent on any of it remaining unchanged. Years later, when visitors would ask him about the Great Flood and how he had managed to recover from such devastating losses, Chandra would smile and shake his head gently. "I didn't recover from the flood," he would say. "I was transformed by it. The flood didn't take away my life. It revealed to me what my life actually was, underneath all the things I thought defined it." This story illustrates the profound difference between acceptance and resignation, between surrendering to what is and giving up on what could be. Acceptance is not passive. It's the most powerful foundation for effective action. When we stop wasting energy fighting against what has already happened, we free up all that energy for responding creatively to current circumstances. In our modern lives, we face floods of different kinds, job losses that devastate our financial security, relationship endings that shatter our emotional landscape, health crises that transform our physical capabilities, global events that disrupt our assumptions about how the world works. The principle Chandra embodied applies to all these situations. Resistance to what has already occurred prevents us from responding wisely to what exists now. When you lose a job, you can spend months consumed with anger about the unfairness of the situation, dwelling on what you should have done differently, resenting the people who made the decision. Or you can accept that your employment has ended and put all your energy into exploring what kind of work would actually fulfill you, what opportunities might exist that weren't available while you were locked into your previous position. When a relationship ends, you can remain stuck in bitterness about how your partner failed to appreciate you, replaying arguments and nursing grievances about their shortcomings. Or you can accept that this relationship has concluded and focus on understanding what you learned about yourself, what you want in future relationships, how you can grow into someone more capable of lasting love. When illness limits your physical abilities, you can rage against the unfairness of your condition, mourn endlessly for the activities you can no longer pursue, resist adapting to your new limitations. Or you can accept your changed circumstances and discover what kinds of meaning, joy, and contribution are possible within your current capabilities. Acceptance doesn't mean you have to be happy about difficult circumstances or pretend that losses don't matter. Chandra felt genuine sadness about losing his beautiful home and productive farm. What he didn't do was waste energy, insisting that the flood shouldn't have happened, that life was unfair, that he was a victim of circumstances beyond his control. He felt his feelings fully, then put his energy into working with reality as it actually existed, rather than as he wished it would be. The practical application of this principle requires developing what Buddhists call beginner's mind, the ability to approach even familiar situations with fresh curiosity rather than rigid expectations. When your carefully laid plans are disrupted, instead of immediately trying to force them back on track, you can pause and ask, what opportunities does this disruption reveal that I couldn't see before? When someone you trust disappoints you, instead of focusing exclusively on how they've failed to meet your expectations, you can explore, what does this teach me about the nature of trust and the importance of emotional independence? When global events create uncertainty about the future, instead of clinging desperately to old assumptions about how things should work, you can investigate. How can I adapt to these new realities in ways that might actually improve my life? This doesn't mean becoming passive or fatalistic. Chandra didn't just sit and wait for his life to improve after the flood. He actively participated in designing and building something better. But his actions came from acceptance of current reality rather than resistance to it, and this made all the difference in their effectiveness and his own peace of mind throughout the process. The deepest teaching of acceptance is that it reveals the creative potential hidden within every apparent disaster. When we're not wasting energy fighting what has already happened, we become capable of seeing possibilities that resistance makes invisible. When we're not attached to maintaining things exactly as they were, we become free to explore what they might become. As you prepare for sleep tonight, consider what floods have occurred in your own life, what changes, losses, or disruptions you've been resisting rather than accepting. Perhaps it's a recent change that still feels raw and unwelcome. Or maybe it's an old wound that you've never fully allowed to heal, because accepting it feels like giving up. Tomorrow you'll have opportunities to practice the power of acceptance in small ways, when plans change unexpectedly, when other people don't behave as you'd hoped, when circumstances fail to unfold according to your preferences. In each of these moments, you can choose between resistance and acceptance, between fighting what is and working with what is. The sixth principle of becoming unshakable is this: acceptance is the foundation of all effective action. When you stop fighting what has already happened, you free yourself to respond creatively to what exists now. When you embrace change instead of resisting it, you discover possibilities that were hidden by your attachment to how things used to be. This doesn't make you weak or passive. It makes you like water, which is soft enough to flow around any obstacle but powerful enough to carve the Grand Canyon. It makes you like Chandra, sitting peacefully on his veranda as everything he had built disappeared underwater, finding in that moment of total loss the seeds of something even more beautiful. Rest now in the knowledge that, whatever changes life brings, you have within you the capacity to flow with them rather than be broken by them. Like the water that flooded Chandra's village, you can accept the shape of whatever contains you while never losing your essential nature. In this acceptance lies not defeat, but the ultimate victory, the ability to transform any circumstance into an opportunity for growth, any ending into a new beginning, any loss into the foundation for something you couldn't have imagined before. Principle 7. Living according to nature. High in the Himalayan foothills of ancient Nepal, where eagles soar between peaks that touch the realm of gods and the morning mist carries prayers whispered by countless generations, we encounter a teaching that reveals the deepest secret of effortless living. Here, in a place where the rhythm of seasons dictates the rhythm of life itself, lived a master whose understanding of natural law would transform how we see our place in the cosmic dance. This is the story of how true power comes not from fighting against life's natural flow, but from learning to move in perfect harmony with forces far greater and wiser than our individual will. The mountain village of Dharamkot clung to the hillside like a cluster of prayer flags. Its stone houses and terraced gardens carved into slopes so steep that walking from one end of the village to the other felt like climbing a sacred mountain. Here, where the air was thin enough that every breath felt precious, and the silence profound enough that your own heartbeat seemed loud, the cycle of seasons wasn't just weather. It was the organizing principle of all existence. Spring brought the melting of high snows that would fill the streams and awaken the sleeping earth. Summer offered brief months of intensive growth when every available hour was spent tending crops that would sustain life through the long winter ahead. Autumn demanded the wisdom to harvest at precisely the right moment, to preserve and store with the care of someone who understood that survival depended on working with nature's timing rather than human convenience. And winter brought the deep rest that allowed both land and people to gather strength for the cycle to begin again. In this village lived a man known simply as Lobsang, whose very presence seemed to embody the peaceful rhythm of the mountains themselves. He had arrived in Dharamkot 30 years earlier as a young monk fleeing the political turmoil in the valleys below, carrying nothing but his robes and a wooden begging bowl, seeking only a quiet place to deepen his practice of meditation and study. What he had discovered in those 3 decades was something far more profound than retreat from the world. He had learned how to live as an integral part of the natural order, moving through his days with the same effortless grace that governed the movement of clouds across mountain peaks and water-down hillsides. Lobsang's daily routine was so perfectly synchronized with natural rhythms that visitors often mistook it for rigid discipline, but those who stayed long enough to observe closely realized they were witnessing something entirely different. A human life lived in such harmony with cosmic patterns that effort and struggle had become almost unnecessary. He would wake naturally as the first light touched the eastern peaks, not because he forced himself to rise early, but because his body had learned to respond to the same cues that awakened the birds and opened the mountain flowers. His morning meditation began as the sky lightened from black to deep blue to the pale gold that preceded sunrise, his practice flowing seamlessly into the day's awakening rather than fighting against his natural energy patterns. When the sun crested the mountains and bathed the village in warm light, Lobsang would begin his physical work, tending the small garden where he grew vegetables that fed not just himself, but any neighbor who needed fresh food, maintaining the mountain paths that connected the village to the outside world, or helping with whatever seasonal tasks the community required. But his work never felt forced or urgent, never carried the frantic quality that characterized so many people's efforts to impose their will on circumstances. Instead, he worked like water flowing downhill, taking the path of least resistance, while accomplishing exactly what needed to be done, using the minimum energy necessary to achieve maximum effectiveness. What made Lobsang's approach so remarkable was not just its efficiency, but its impact on everyone around him. Other villagers found that projects completed more smoothly when he was involved, that conflicts resolved more easily in his presence, that the overwhelming tasks of mountain life somehow became manageable when approached with his patient, natural timing. Children would follow him around the village not because he entertained them, but because being near him felt peaceful in a way they couldn't explain. Even the village animals seemed calmer in his presence, as if they recognized in him someone who belonged to the same natural order that governed their own lives. Yet Lobsang's harmony with natural law would face its greatest test through an encounter with someone who represented the exact opposite approach to life, a wealthy merchant from the lowlands whose very presence would illuminate the place. Difference between fighting against nature and flowing with it. His name was Tenzin Norbu, and he arrived in Dharamkot during the peak of summer, carrying the frenetic energy of the commercial world like a storm cloud preceding a tempest. Norbu was successful by any external measure. His trading ventures stretched across the Himalayan region. His caravans carried goods from India to Tibet and back again. His wealth allowed him to live in comfort that most mountain people could barely imagine. But success had come at a cost that was written in the tight lines around his eyes, the constant tension in his shoulders, the way he seemed unable to sit still for more than a few minutes without checking on some urgent business matter. Norbu had come to the mountain village, not for spiritual reasons, but because one of his trading routes passed through the area, and he needed to negotiate with local authorities about transport permits and tax obligations. His plan was to spend 2 days completing his business, and then return immediately to the pressures and opportunities of the commercial world below. He had no interest in mountain spirituality, no patience for what he viewed as the slow, backward ways of village life, no time for anything that didn't directly contribute to his business objectives. But the mountains, as they often do, had different plans. On Norbu's second morning in the village, a sudden summer storm swept through the region, bringing winds so fierce that travel became impossible and rain so heavy that the mountain paths turned into rushing streams. What should have been a brief business trip suddenly became an extended stay, trapping the impatient merchant in exactly the kind of slow, natural environment he spent his life trying to avoid. For the first 3 days of his enforced isolation, Norbu paced through the village like a caged tiger, muttering constantly about lost opportunities and delayed shipments, checking obsessively for any break in the weather that might allow his escape. His agitation was so intense that it seemed to create its own weather system. Other villagers began avoiding the areas where he spent his time. Children stopped playing in the courtyards near his temporary lodging. Even the usual mountain bird song seemed muted when he was present. It was on the 4th morning that Norbu encountered Lobsang in a way that would begin to change everything he thought he knew about how life should be lived. The merchant had risen before dawn, unable to sleep due to his anxiety about delayed business, and had wandered outside hoping to find some sign that the weather was clearing. Instead, he found Lobsang sitting in meditation posture in the small garden behind the village temple, perfectly still, despite the light rain that continued to fall, his face peaceful in a way that seemed to mock Norbu's inner turmoil. "How can you just sit there?" Norbu demanded, his voice sharp with frustration. "Don't you understand that this storm is ruining everything? People have responsibilities, schedules to keep, obligations to meet. The world doesn't stop just because the weather is inconvenient." Lobsang opened his eyes slowly, the way morning flowers open to greet the sun, and looked at the agitated merchant with an expression of such gentle curiosity that Norbu felt his anger falter slightly. "The world is not stopping," Lobsang said quietly, his voice barely audible above the sound of rain on leaves. "It's continuing exactly as it always has. The storm is part of the world's movement, not a disruption of it." "That's easy for you to say," Norbu replied, though with less vehemence than before. "You don't have contracts to fulfill, deadlines to meet, people depending on you to deliver goods on time. You can afford to sit in the rain and pretend that schedules don't matter." Lobsang smiled with the gentleness of someone who had once carried the same burdens that now weighed so heavily on his visitor. "Tell me," he said, "in all your years of business, have you ever experienced a season when everything went exactly according to your plans? When no storms delayed your caravans, no floods blocked your routes, no unexpected events forced you to adapt your carefully laid schedules?" Norbu paused, caught off guard by the question. "Well, no," he admitted reluctantly. "There are always complications, always unexpected problems to solve." "And how much of your energy do you spend fighting against these complications?" Lobsang asked. "How much time do you waste being angry about delays you cannot control, frustrated by weather you cannot change, resentful towards circumstances that are simply the natural flow of events?" The question struck deeper than Norbu wanted to admit. He realized that he spent enormous amounts of mental and emotional energy raging against situations he was powerless to alter, as if his anger could somehow force the world to conform to his timeline. "But if I don't push against obstacles, How do I get anything accomplished? He asked. If I just accept every delay and setback, won't my business fall apart? Lobsang gestured toward the rain-soaked garden around them, where every plant and tree was receiving the water it needed to continue growing, where the storm that seemed so disruptive to human plans was actually essential to the mountain ecosystem's health. Look at how nature accomplishes its goals, he said. The river doesn't waste energy fighting against the rocks in its path. It flows around them, or over them, or gradually wears them smooth. The trees don't struggle against the wind. They bend so they won't break, and use the storm's energy to spread their seeds to new ground. The seasons don't try to rush their transitions. Spring doesn't try to become summer before the snow has finished melting, and autumn doesn't resist the coming of winter. Buddha taught, just as a candle cannot burn without fire, men cannot live without a spiritual life. What Lobsang was revealing to the frustrated merchant was that this spiritual life is not separate from practical life, but is actually the most practical approach possible, a way of living that accomplishes more with less effort by working with natural forces rather than against them. Come with me, Lobsang said, rising gracefully from his meditation posture. Let me show you something that might help you understand what I mean. He led Norbu to the edge of the village, where a small stream cascaded down the mountainside in a series of natural pools and waterfalls. The recent rains had swollen the stream, making its voice louder and its movement more dramatic, but its essential character remained unchanged, water following the path of least resistance, while accomplishing the monumental task of carving the mountain landscape. This stream, Lobsang said, travels hundreds of miles from its source high in the peaks to its destination in the great rivers below. It carries tons of sediment, provides water for countless plants and animals, shapes the very geography of this region. Yet it never struggles, never forces, never fights against the terrain. It simply follows natural law, always flowing downward, always taking the easiest available path, always adapting its course to work with the landscape rather than against it. Norbu watched the water tumbling over rocks and around boulders, carving channels and pools with patient persistence that made human urgency seem almost comical by comparison. But water is different from business, he protested, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. Commerce requires deadlines, requires pushing through obstacles, requires imposing human will on circumstances. Does it, Lobsang asked gently, or does successful commerce, like everything else in nature, work best when it flows with natural patterns rather than against them? Think about the most successful traders you know. Do they succeed by fighting against market forces, or by understanding those forces so well that they can work with them? The question forced Norbu to reconsider assumptions he had never questioned. His most profitable ventures had indeed come not from forcing his will on reluctant markets, but from recognizing opportunities that already existed, from timing his actions to coincide with natural business cycles, from adapting his strategies to work with economic currents, rather than against them. The merchants he most respected were those who seemed to have an intuitive understanding of when to act and when to wait, when to push forward and when to step back. I think I see what you mean, Norbu said slowly. But how do you develop this sense of natural timing? How do you know when to act and when to wait? Lobsang smiled and settled into a comfortable position beside the stream, patting the ground to indicate that Norbu should join him. "The same way the stream knows which way to flow," he said. "By developing sensitivity to the forces that are already in motion, by learning to feel the natural currents, instead of being so focused on your own desires that you miss the information the environment is constantly providing." Over the following days, as the storm gradually cleared, and Norbu's originally planned 2-day visit stretched into more than a week, the merchant found himself drawn into conversations and observations that challenged everything he thought he knew about effective action. Lobsang showed him how the villagers planned their activities around lunar cycles, planted their crops according to seasonal patterns that had been refined over generations, timed their major decisions to coincide with natural rhythms that supported rather than hindered their goals. "Look at how we approach the harvest," Lobsang explained as they walked through the village's terraced fields. "We don't decide when to harvest based on human convenience or artificial deadlines. We watch the plants themselves, feel the quality of the air, observe the behavior of birds and insects that depend on the same cycles we do. When all these natural indicators align, we know it's time to act. The work flows easily because we're working with natural forces rather than against them." "But surely this is just old-fashioned farming," Norbu objected. "It doesn't apply to modern commerce, to the complexities of international trade." Lobsang paused to examine a plant that was just beginning to show signs of ripeness, its leaves changing color in subtle ways that spoke to those who knew how to read nature's language. "Natural law operates at every level," he said. "In your business there are seasons too, times when markets are receptive to new ideas,